The man looked at the girl intently and informed her that she should prepare to leave for Irugo. Aristina, the first princess of Sylvanus, looked at him intently but said nothing. Everyone present whispered among themselves because they understood that the princess needed to enter into a marriage of convenience with a barbarian. They knew it was too much, but still you did not bleed His Majesty. His Majesty asked with a grin if it was not fortunate that she was his daughter. He said with a fierce grin that she was useless, but it could be done even if I could use the noble blood flowing through her veins. A month later, the young lady finally set out on her journey as she followed her father's words without question. The young lady in turn was very happy with this opportunity, and with a smile and an indecent gesture, she said goodbye to her past life. She was glad that she was finally able to get rid of her hated homeland and her even more hated father. She sighed heavily because she understood that her father really was crazy. Her father was the emperor himself, and in order to satisfy his only desire as a conqueror, he committed various forms of violence against her. One day, opening her eyes, she saw the hall, which was engulfed in fire, and if she had not managed to get out, she would have died. The emperor looked at her intently with a smirk on his face. He smiled and asked if she was awake. Aristina, frozen in shock, she realized that it was her father who had locked all the windows and lit the fire. More than her burns her lungs, more than her limbs, which had begun to blister, her heart hurt the most. After this incident, she was separated from her younger sister. She was locked in an unsightly room into which only dim light entered. Unfortunately, 10 years is not the shortest period of time, and this time was enough for her heart to burn to the ground. She sighed heavily as she knew that she was very lucky that thanks to her imprisonment, she was able to see her past life. Fortunately, she was happy about leaving, but when she thought of leaving her sister, she felt uneasy being alone. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew that now she needed to think about her future. She thought about it and wondered what Irugo was like. Irugo, a place where fire and iron rule a land of barbarians that is isolated by the plains and surrounded by demons. She remembered the emperor smirking as he informed her that she would be sleeping in the same bed as a demon-bound human. She knew that her father really enjoyed showering her fiancé with bad words because he was unhappy that they managed to avoid war this time. The current emperor was positive because he wanted to perform a feat and capture Irugo. Unfortunately for the emperor, however, he lost the war. And the reason for his loss was Tarkin, the young lady's future husband. As a result, the heads of state decided to conclude a peace treaty, which led to a marriage of convenience. The lady knew that her father had no intention of ending the war, and the truce was only concluded to buy him time. She knew that he wanted to occupy the territories and start a war in the near future. She sighed heavily as she knew that was the reason he had sent her away as a discarded card. Aristina understood perfectly well that her death would fall on the shoulders of Irugo. She understood perfectly well that declaring war on a country that had entered into a marriage alliance would be a moral duty. She looked into the distance with a smirk, wondering if the emperor suspected that she wanted to give him a huge surprise. She sighed heavily as she knew that she needed to establish cooperation with one person first. Sometime later, they made a halt. The young lady looked at the exquisite table setting with surprise and intently. She glanced sideways at everyone present as they whispered furiously behind her back. From the moment she was sent on her way by carriage instead of through the portal, she suspected that something was wrong. Unfortunately, the young lady did not leave the carriage for almost 10 days. When she finally decided to change the uncomfortable dress, the knights knocked on the carriage window. But now she was suddenly asked to leave. She saw that tea and desserts were prepared. She knew it would be funny for her to tell them not to worry, but she also understood perfectly well that now was not the time for this. The lady understood that she had to behave as she did during her stay in the palace. She knew she had to be calm and brief. A moment later, the lady threw her thoughts away as she looked at the teacup and noticed someone heading towards her. She froze in surprise, looking at the cup, unable to move. But a moment later, one of the young ladies stumbled and poured hot water on the princess. The princess was in shock. She screamed in pain as she was scalded with boiling water. The young lady looked at the princess in surprise and asked for forgiveness, since she did not mean to, but she did it. She offered her help to the princess with a smile. All the ladies present with smirks told the princess that she was wet from head to toe. They mockingly said that such a look was not suitable for Varvara's bride. The knights in turn also looked at the princess with mockery. The young ladies, without moving from their place, looked mockingly at the crippled princess. The young princess came back to reality and stared at the hot cup of tea. She was puzzled because she knew what the future held for her. She looked intently at everyone present. She understood perfectly well that her father was eager to obtain one ability, namely the Emperor's Eye. An ability he thought she couldn't have, but luckily for her, she could see the past, present, and future. She thought for a moment, wanting to see what would happen next. She sighed heavily as she had already seen everything through the cup. In other words, what she just saw through the surface of the cup must definitely happen in her future. The young lady slowly approached the princess, carrying a full kettle of hot boiling water. She looked at the princess with a fierce grin, knowing that she had to act now. She looked at the princess, but she in turn sat quietly with an imperturbable expression on her face. With lightning speed, the princess turned around and looked intently at the lady. The young lady stumbled in fright and screamed as hot water poured on her. A moment later, the young lady began to scream in pain as she burned her face. A moment later, there was chaos in their mini-camp. The young princess in turn looked intently at everyone present. The young lady screamed at her, not understanding what had happened. The princess looked at the lady in surprise and asked why she was interrogating her. The young lady was taken aback and looked at the princess in surprise. The princess sighed heavily and said that she simply stood up from her seat. She didn't understand why the lady was now speaking as if she had spilled hot water by mistake. She understood that it was not her fault that what happened. She asked in surprise if she really had to act as a nanny. The young lady was taken aback as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked at the princess with fury because she did not understand why she spoke so smoothly. The princess looked closely at the lady and said that it looked like she really did need a nanny. The lady recoiled and looked at the princess in bewilderment. The princess in turn looked at the young lady with a grin as she understood that today she was the winner. A moment later, the girl screamed furiously as she realized that she would be left with a scar on her beautiful face. She was shocked and didn't know what to do now. The ladies looked at the situation closely and gave in. With lightning speed, the young lady ran to the girl who was bursting into tears because of her injury. The princess was very angry because she understood that they were mocking others, but they did not even allow the thought that they themselves could suffer. By doing so, they were able to understand that they could hurt themselves. The scene seen through the Emperor's eye helped her change her mind, because if she had sat still, she could have gotten burned. After some time, the young ladies looked at the princess with caution. The girl looked at the princess intently as she knew that she had no manners, but now she was perplexed because she did not understand why the princess was acting so elegantly now. She was puzzled and simply could not take her eyes off the beautiful princess. The girl, taken aback, turned away from the princess. She decided to throw all her thoughts away. She was furious, and she understood that the emperor himself had given her the order, but in fact she was the only one who suffered. Sometime later, the girls trampled the princess's clothes in the mud with grins on their faces and asked what they should do since she didn't have any other change of clothes. The lady told the princess with a grin that such a noble person as she could not wear the clothes of the poor. But the princess in turn did not listen to them, and with the speed of lightning grabbed her clothes and ran to the carriage. The girl looked at the princess in surprise, as she did not understand why she acted in such a way. Frozen by the carriage, she looked at the princess in bewilderment. She was surprised when the princess, with the speed of lightning, curtained the windows of the carriage. She looked at her companion in surprise and asked what had just happened. The princess knew that after that day the maids became more hesitant in their mockery of her. They just kept on being capricious and trying to ruin her clothes. The young princess smirked as she tried on the clothes they had ruined, wondering if they thought they could hurt her like that. She knew that compared to having boiling water thrown at her, this level of bullying was very sweet. She knew that even though it was a political marriage, she still needed to prepare a new set of clothes. She realized that unfortunately she could not wear the new dress as it was completely dirty. She sighed heavily as she knew very well about the emperor's plans. But for some reason it seemed to her that the dress would be perfect for a wedding. At the western gate, the young princess was already awaited. Young people were talking among themselves, waiting for the princess. The young man said with a smile that he thought the princess would faint at the sight of them. The young man sighed heavily and asked his subordinate to behave quietly as a delegation would arrive soon. He looked into the distance and told everyone that they needed to go down. He clearly saw the carriages heading towards them. Some time later, the beautiful knight informed everyone that he was accompanying the first princess. The young people were perplexed and did not understand why they did not use the portal and arrived in carriages. The knight glanced sideways at everyone present. He looked down at them from top to bottom. The young men saw that the maids were concerned about their outfits, and the carriages were decorated with magnificent precious stones. The knight looked closely at everyone present and said that they should bow their heads before the princess. The knight said with a joyful smile that before them was Princess Aristina herself. Everyone present froze in shock when they saw the princess. They were puzzled and could not take their eyes off her as she was shabby and very small. They were shocked because they saw that she looked like a dirty lump of cotton wool. The young man looked at the princess in bewilderment as he saw that in comparison with their luxurious carriages, her outfit was strange and dirty. He looked at everyone present with fury as he realized what the emperor was really planning. She sighed heavily as she understood that the emperor wanted to send her away in the most unkempt form. The emperor, in turn, understood perfectly well that the knights and luxurious gifts would demonstrate the still strong fighting power of their empire. The emperor understood that such a dirty princess would be a perfect fit for such trash. The young people were furious because the delegation from the empire had humiliated their master. The young lady sighed heavily as she had expected such a reaction. However, she knew that she simply could not be embarrassed by such treatment. With the speed of lightning, she moved from her place and rushed towards the young master. The young man in turn also took a step towards the princess. For a while they looked at each other intently. She looked at the young man and wondered if it was her husband standing in front of her now. She was struck by his beauty and could not take her gaze off him. Looking at the young man, she realized that he had the highest status. A moment later, the young man bowed politely and greeted the princess. Aristina saw that he was very polite and was not even embarrassed by her appearance. She looked at him in surprise and wondered if he was being too polite to her. Now she realized that he seemed to be below her in status. Durant informed the princess that he was ordered to escort her. She asked in surprise where her future husband was, and Durant said that he had gone hunting. She sighed heavily as she knew that this was the first sign that their married life would not be very good. She sighed heavily, collecting her thoughts. Looking at the young man, she said that it seemed to her that her future husband was very embarrassed in front of her. She looked intently at the young people, not taking her gaze off them. The young people were shocked by this statement. Durant sighed heavily and, bowing, informed the princess that it was not so simple that monsters appeared, and he went hunting. The young lady thought for a moment as she now understood why her future husband had left his post. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he didn't tell her about it right away. Durant, bowing, told the princess that she had only asked where her future husband was, so he had given a simple answer. She sighed heavily and said that one cannot deceive a person with a pure lie. Aristina, looking at the knight, said that even the truth could become a false answer that would fool another. She sighed heavily as she realized that she hadn't thought about it before, but now she realized that the situation here was different from her time in the Empire. She realized that she no longer had to bow to everyone. She understood that she would be surrounded by people who wanted nothing from her. She understood that she didn't have to live up to their expectations. She looked closely at the young man and with an innocent smile said that in the future he had better not fool her either. The young man froze in shock as he did not expect to see her dazzling smile. He understood that even on her dirty face her eyes shone like stars. It felt like she had shot him straight in the heart, and now he realized that the princess was completely different from what he had expected. The young lady looked at everyone present in surprise and asked in bewilderment what they were talking about. The young men were furious and shouted that their princess was not dirty at all. She sighed heavily as she understood that up until this point, her companions had not been at all concerned about her appearance. She saw that Durant took a step back to avoid an argument since the king was not there. The young man looked at everyone present with fury and a moment later turned his attention to the princess. He came closer to her and greeted her with a gentle smile. Aristina looked at him in bewilderment. Sometime later, the young men were riding horses and discussing this situation. He sighed heavily and informed his friend that the political marriage could be dissolved, but they must not allow controversy to flare up. The young man sighed heavily as this was all difficult for him. He smiled and told everyone that he didn't even expect the princess to turn out like this. Durant sighed heavily and told his friends not to be too kind to the delegation as they might send assassins. A moment later, he froze in place in surprise. He was taken aback because he saw many carriages in front of the palace. The young man sighed heavily as he realized that everyone had decided to conduct reconnaissance. He knew his master was absent from the meeting because of the monsters, but he didn't understand why the other royals were idle. A moment later, everyone started whispering as they saw the carriages from the Empire. They were wondering what kind of person the princess would be. But a moment later, their gaze darkened. The young princess in turn slowly left the carriage. She saw that everyone had gathered to look at her. In turn, the young princess looked intently at everyone present. She felt inquisitive gazes on her, examining her from head to toe. She realized that countless eyes were directed at her like spears and arrows. The young lady looked at the princess with a smirk as they expected to see a real princess, not a beggar. Aristina saw that they were simply overwhelmed with hostility towards her. The young lady asked the princess with a smirk if she really thought that if she got to the kingdom, something would change. They laughed at her because they knew they could not expect any other reception. Durant looked at the princess's men with confusion as he knew they were supposed to protect her, but now it was the other way around. In turn, the princess stood quietly in the center of everyone's attention. The princess's knights looked at her with mockery. A moment later, a man passed by the knight. The knight was taken aback and flinched when the man took the cloth from his hands. The knight was furious and rushed at the man, screaming because he had taken away some very expensive silk. But a moment later, the knight was taken aback and froze in place. The young lady in turn was taken aback and turned around in surprise as someone threw a beautiful fabric over her. She was in shock as the young man lifted her up with his lightning speed. She was puzzled because she realized that someone had wrapped her in silk. She froze in place and couldn't even move. The young man looked at everyone present with anger and said that the most valuable things should be with his bride. The young people greeted their master with smiles. The princess froze in place in surprise and looked intently at the young man. She couldn't take her eyes off his as they sparkled like sunbeams. She looked intently at the young man as she realized that this was her future husband, Tarkin. Aristina looked at Tarkin intently and with surprise. Aristina noticed that he was very tall. She understood that although he had done nothing remarkable, the proud Sylvanians did not utter a word. Tarkin looked at everyone present with a stern and angry gaze. The young men backed away. The young man looked at him puzzled and said that they heard that his bride had arrived. He looked at them intently but said nothing. With lightning speed, he left their presence. Sometime later, he brought the young princess into the room. He asked her not to be mistaken since he did so, because he did not really like the way his brothers and sisters were gossiping about her. He looked closely at the young princess and informed her that it was not at all because she was good. Aristina looked at him in bewilderment because she knew that naturally everything was just like that. He glanced sideways at the maid and ordered her to help the princess wash herself. She noticed that it was stained with the blood of monsters. She informed him that they were still not married. The young man was taken aback by the princess's words, as he had not expected to hear anything like that at all. An awkward atmosphere arose between them. She did not understand why he was looking at her like that. Tarkin said with a grin that he was not going to eat her after she washed herself, so she didn't need to worry. He looked at the princess intently and said that he would like a dirty girl like her. Aristina looked at him in surprise. He sighed heavily as he simply wanted to say that she was dirty. Looking at the young princess, he realized that there was a misunderstanding between them. She looked at him intently and told him that he was a total pervert. The young man froze in shock as he did not expect to hear something like that. He looked at her intently and said that he would not eat her. Aristina told him that was all that was why. They quarreled for a while, but the princess finally said that she meant that they were not married, so they could not bathe together. The young man froze in shock as he now understood why she had said such words. He looked at the princess intently as he saw her piercing gaze on him. He sighed heavily as he now understood what she was talking about. He informed the princess that he would go wash himself somewhere else. She looked at him in surprise, but then realized that it was normal that there were several places to swim in the castle. The princess was a little puzzled as she had lived alone in captivity for too long, so she had forgotten some things. She sighed heavily and agreed with him. A moment later, she approached the maid and asked her to accompany her to the bath. The young man looked at the princess intently as you thought she was a very strange girl. Initially he thought she would be confused. He assumed that if she was related by blood to the aristocracy, then you would be in a beautiful palace. For this reason, he thought that she was not at all used to such situations. But at that moment, she looked as if she had become insensitive, as she was no longer able to be proud. He sighed heavily as he did not understand at all why she was so dirty. The young lady looked with admiration at the beautiful bathtub with warm water. She hoped that the water would not be too cold, but in fact, the bath was filled with warm water. The maids looked closely at the princess and said with a smile that they would help her. She looked at them in surprise because she knew that she had never been courted like this. The maids slowly began to look after the princess and prepare her for taking a bath. The princess was surprised as she saw a businesslike and professional approach from the maids. She had only ever met maids who constantly ignored her, so this kind of respectful behavior was wildly forged for her. The maid looked in surprise at the hair of the young princess, which sparkled brighter than the sun. She looked at the sweet princess in surprise, as she did not expect to see something like this. Sometime later, the maids were courting the princess. She looked at the maids in surprise and asked if something was wrong. The maid froze in shock as she saw mystical violet eyes like the dawn's sparkling silver hair. The maid froze in place in shock and embarrassment. The maids, taken aback, asked the princess for forgiveness. Aristina looked at them in bewilderment. A moment later, the young lady climbed into the warm bath. She sighed heavily as she felt wonderful. She knew that she simply had to put all her plans on hold and get some good rest now. Sometime later, she froze in place in surprise as the water parted in front of her. She was surprised that a vision appeared in such a situation. Aristina knew that the splashing of water was a sign of the emperor's eye being active. She was surprised and did not understand what she would now be able to see. A moment later, she saw her future husband, but unfortunately, she did not understand when it was happening. Looking at the young man, she hoped that this would be the near past. The young man recoiled as he heard someone calling him. He looked at the young lady in surprise as he did not expect to see her. Diona looked at him with a smile and asked what had made him go into such deep thought. He sighed heavily and, looking away from her, said that he was not thinking about anything. She looked at him intently as she could see that something was bothering him. Diona asked him if he really liked the princess. The princess froze in shock as she did not expect to see or hear anything like this. She stared at the image, wondering if they were talking about her now. The young princess thought for a moment as the girl asked Tarkin if he liked the dust ball. She was puzzled and wondered how he usually behaved that he received such questions. He looked at her with cold fury and asked if she really thought he liked such a girl. He looked at the young lady with a grin and said that it was simply impossible. The princess in turn sighed heavily and looked at her reflection in surprise. He glanced sideways at his companion and informed her that she knew this very well herself. Tarkin said with sadness in his voice that his heart was unchanged. Aristina thought for a moment. She knew that there is no love in a political marriage. She remembered the girl he was talking to. She thought it might work in her favor if she was his lover. The princess glanced sideways at the maid and asked her to take her to Tarkin. The maid looked at the young princess in surprise, but still agreed. Aristina really wanted to rest, but now she had a chance to get rid of the watching gazes. At the same time, servants who had arrived from the Empire inspected the interior decoration of the palace. Diona poured tea for Tarkin with a joyful smile. She glanced at him sideways with a soft smile because she knew he was still the same. She knew that now in front of her was a relaxed predator, difficult to approach. She knew he was very elegant and dangerous, but she was very surprised when he suddenly stood up for the princess. A moment later, a maid entered their room and announced that the princess had arrived to see him. They looked at the maid in surprise as they did not expect to hear such a thing. But a moment later, the young man sighed heavily and told the maid that she could let the princess in. The young lady in turn froze in shock when she saw the princess. Tarkin was also stunned by the sight of the princess. He froze and stared at the young princess. He wondered if this was really the man he had seen earlier. He looked at her in surprise and called out with no less surprise. She looked at everyone present with bewilderment as she understood that the other inhabitants of the palace reacted to her in a similar way. She wondered if they were comparing her to that dust ball. Aristina slowly walked up to the sofa and sat down quietly. The princess glanced sideways at the young girl, wanting her to serve her tea. Diona in turn shuddered as she had completely forgotten herself. Taken aback, the young lady asked the princess for forgiveness. She looked at the princess intently as she could not allow a conflict to break out in front of Tarkin. She looked at the princess with a smile and said that she was very glad to meet her, and she also introduced herself. Aristina looked closely at the young girl as she knew her, having seen her recently in her vision. The young man looked at them intently while he put aside all his documents. Looking at Dion, he said that she could go. The young lady bowed and, listening to his order, left. For some time after, they sat in silence looking at each other. He asked why she was looking for a meeting with him. The young lady looked at him in surprise as she knew that they would soon become a married couple. She looked at him and asked if they couldn't just have tea together and talk. Tarkin said that they were already together. She looked at him intently, wondering if he really thought that she had volunteered to marry him. She sighed heavily as she realized that everything was not going as she had planned. A moment later, she was taken aback as she really liked the tea. It was the first time she drank it. Even though she didn't come of her own free will, she didn't think that everything would be so good. She sighed heavily and informed him that she had not come to him to have a nice chat with him. She wanted to get straight to the point and tell him everything without concealment. The young princess looked at him intently and said that she would like to start a business with him. Tarkin looked at the princess in surprise, as he did not expect to hear anything like that. She understood perfectly well that neither love nor power had much meaning for her. For this reason, she only needed money. The young lady was very eager to buy herself freedom so that she could go where she wanted and look at what she wanted. She knew that no one would be able to lock her in a cage again. Tarkin looked at the princess in surprise, as he did not understand what she was talking about. The princess looked at the young man and said that she did not have the entrepreneur's disease at all. She said that she was not asking him to lend her money or to invest. She began to bombard him with words and was taken aback when she saw that he looked even more irritated. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he was looking at her like that. Looking away from her, he said that she was not going to use the money allocated for the prince's upkeep as an investment in a business, and that was something he needed to sort out. She sighed heavily and informed the young man that the arranged marriage had politically intertwined them together. She said that it would be a good idea for this reason to create a similar union in which they would help each other. The young lady looked at him intently and said that she was not talking about a strong friendship now, but about business. He knew that she was brave in a way that no one had ever said anything like that to him before. He agreed with her with a smile. Tarkin looked closely at the princess and asked what she could give him in return. The princess in turn looked at the young man and called him by name. He was taken aback. She asked with a grin if there was anything he wanted from her. She hoped that he would give her an answer sooner, since she generally knew what he wanted. In turn, the princess knew a lot thanks to the Emperor's eye. Tarkin angrily turned his gaze away from her. She looked at him in surprise as she saw that he looked as if he couldn't look at her. He asked angrily what she could do with her thin arms, which looked as if she couldn't lift a fork. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to hear something like that. Looking at her hands, the princess informed him that she had the most ordinary hands. She was puzzled because she understood that he did not trust her at all. A moment later, she stood up and informed him that they should sit down at the negotiating table where she could demonstrate her talent. As she left with a smile, she said that the goods needed to be checked before signing. Standing near the palace, the young people whispered and discussed the princess. The young lady told her companions that she had heard that the princess had a mental illness. She said that this was the reason why she was kept in isolation for a long time. They were shocked because they understood that Tarkin was forced to marry such a girl. The young man was puzzled. He understood that if Tarkin became the heir to the throne, then such a girl would become the heir's wife. They understood perfectly well that Tarkin had accomplished great feats on the battlefield, but governing a country was a completely different matter. The young lady said that for this reason, Hamir was more suitable for the role of crown prince. The young man stopped his companion as they noticed Tarkin in the distance. The young men froze and looked intently at Tarkin. They were puzzled and did not know where he was heading, since they knew that His Majesty was now in that direction. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew they needed to start watching their words. They looked at the young man with burning eyes as his appearance captivated everyone. They saw his black, darkness-like hair flashing, but a moment later they also noticed flashes of silver hair. The young lady looked at everyone present in surprise. The girls looked at each other. They were shocked because now they realized that the beggar in rags was the beautiful princess, the lord of the plains of blood and iron monsters, King Irugo. Nefter looked at his subordinate in surprise and asked if the princess really wanted to meet him. The man said that everything was correct and Tarkin came with her. The young lady looked at her father and asked with a smile why they didn't meet. She told her father that she was very interested in seeing the rumored princess. Looking at her father, Ekaterina said that the young princess would soon become a member of their family and they needed to get to know each other. The king looked closely at his daughter, for he already knew that she, along with the other princes and princesses, had gone to see her daughter-in-law. He looked at her tenderly and smiled, for he found it very sweet that her intentions were so obvious. The king told his subordinate that he had no business, so he saw no reason to refuse. The young lady threw herself on her father's neck with a smile. She looked at her father with a joyful smile because she knew that now everything would become much more fun. Ekaterina knew that now she could make the dirty princess a laughingstock in front of her father. She saw her brother and thought that he was very worried because he brought a beggar woman to the palace. She looked at him with a smile as the beggar princess had lifted her spirits. The young princess slowly crossed the threshold and greeted everyone with a smile. Ekaterina froze in place from shock. Aristina, looking at the king, said with a smile that although the request was unexpected, she was still grateful that the king accepted it. The king froze in surprise. He saw graceful gestures and subtle manners. He knew that it was not the second daughter who would arrive, but the first who was isolated, so he did not have high expectations about the girl. He looked at her closely and said with a gentle smile that she must have been very tired after traveling so long. The king looked at his subordinate and asked him to bring tea with sweets. Aristina sighed heavily as she saw that the beginning had gone well. She easily remembered what she saw through the emperor's eye, but she was very worried that her body would not obey her. She knew that, judging by their reactions, she had made a good first impression. A moment later, a servant placed a treat in front of the princess. She looked closely at the treat as she saw this dessert through the eyes of the emperor, yellow and sour sweet jelly, frin-frin. Unlike the usual housing, it is more elastic and has a sour-sweet taste. She knew that if the chef had put his hand to this dessert, it would be served even in hostile countries. She really wanted to try it. A moment later, she was taken aback as she realized that now was not the time for this. The young man looked at her in surprise. She sighed heavily and wondered how she could eat when she had not yet proven her worth. She knew she had to demonstrate her skills and salesmanship. Tarkin looked closely at the young princess as he became uneasy. He wondered if she was seriously going to sell something to his father. The king looked at them with a keen gaze and noticed that they had developed a good relationship. He saw that the young people were looking at each other with loving eyes. The king looked closely at the princess and asked why she wanted to meet him beforehand. In all seriousness, the princess looked at the king and began to speak. But suddenly she stopped because she heard a noise. Young people entered the room with the speed of lightning. The young man looked at the princess with a smile as she came to visit their father. The young men looked closely at Tarkin and Aristina as they wanted to know what they were really hiding. The young man looked at his brother with a smile and said that it seemed like he was overjoyed right now. But a moment later, he froze in place in surprise. Stelina looked at the princess in surprise as she knew that she had looked different recently. Paella looked at the princess with cold fury and wondered if she could really be called a beggar now. Martin looked at the young princess with lust. Tarkin in turn looked at them angrily, as he knew that they were all close to the queen. He understood that not knowing that the princess's appearance had changed, they intended to praise her in order to humiliate her. The princess in turn looked intently at the young people. A moment later she asked with coldness in her voice who they were. Stelina quietly called her sister Paella, told his sister not to show any doubts. Paella saw that the princess had washed herself and dressed up before coming to the king. Now she was like a different person. Paella said with disdain that she would forgive the princess now, but next time she must be more careful with her statements. Paella said with fury that they were not servants at all who had been sent here. The sisters looked at each other with a satisfied grin. The sisters spoke to each other as if they understood that the princess had no manners. Tarkin, looking at the sisters, he realized that they had drastically changed their behavior after they had deliberately praised their opponent. Tarkin was a little puzzled, as he still couldn't get used to acting and masks. Tarkin looked sideways at the princess and said that she would do well to keep quiet. Aristina wondered if it would be rude if she showed off her abilities even a little. The prince ran up to the princess and introduced himself with a joyful smile. She looked at everyone present and said that there had been a misunderstanding. Paelamien asked the prince with a grin what kind of misunderstanding they were talking about. Aristina in turn looked at the princess with cold fury and said that she did not ask who they were. She looked at the princess intently and said that it was her monologue. Paelamien was taken aback. Aristina, looking at the princess, said that it seemed to her that they had already met somewhere. Paelamien was a little puzzled. She wondered if the princess remembered her. She was excited and did not understand how the princess could remember her in that chaos. Aristina looked at the prince with a tender smile and called him. He looked at her in surprise as he was mesmerized by her beauty. She smiled and asked if they had met by chance before. He said sheepishly that it seemed they had met before since he had been to the Empire before. Aristina looked closely at the princess and said that she felt like they had not met in Sylvanus. The princess tensed up. Martin nervously asked if they had met in their dreams. He smiled and said that he thought he had seen her there. The princess was furious and wanted her brother to shut his mouth. Paelamien was furious. She knew perfectly well that everything had been confirmed through dialogue. Paelamien knew perfectly well that the princess had seen her. She had heard that during her isolation, the princess had been unable to learn anything and had gone mad. But in reality, this was completely untrue. She looked closely at the princess as she understood that she had a very good mind. Aristina in turn sighed heavily. She knew that her life was a world that was accidentally reflected in the water, a world in which one could not do without observation and a good memory. The king looked closely at the young princess with a small smile on his face. Paelamien looked at her father's wedding in surprise as he smiled while looking at the princess. She was furious because she realized that her father had shown interest in the princess. Paelamien knew very well that if the princess told the king about what had happened in the palace, then their unexpected visit to the tea room would not be perceived as something funny. She understood that it was very dangerous. For this reason, she needed to leave soon and come up with another plan. Stelina angrily asked the princess what she was doing since having a fiancé. She was chatting casually with another man. She shouted that this was very indecent on her part. Paelamien looked at her sister in surprise, as she had not expected such a thing from her at all. Aristina looked closely at the young princess as she recognized her, since she had previously said that her blood was low grade. Stelina looked at the princess with cold fury and asked what she was looking at so intently, since she had just voiced one thought out loud. She looked at the princess with a fierce grin. Aristina looked at her intently as she saw a look filled with contempt and hostility. Aristina thought for a moment, looking at the princess because she knew that she looked grown up, but she still thought like a little child. Stelina in turn was taken aback and angry looking at the princess. She asked if her words really seemed funny to her. Paelamien screamed and called her sister Stelina, looked at her sister in surprise. Paelamien, looking at everyone present, said that the fourth princess was still young and asked them to be understanding towards her. Aristina in turn sipped her tea slowly. She understood that the young lady was still smart. She was well aware that the crown prince had not yet been determined, and now a battle of factions had been entered between the first Prince Hamir, born of the queen, and the second Prince Tarkin, who could also take the throne. Aristina knew that unlike Prince Hamir, Tarkin was born of a commoner, which was his political weakness. Aristina looked at the princess and asked if they doubted her belonging to the imperial family. She wanted to know if they were worried about her origin. The princess was taken aback as they did not expect to hear such a thing. She sighed heavily as she knew that the pure-blood princesses doubted her. She asked if it was because they couldn't challenge Irugo's position. The maid bowed to the queen and said that the princess and the prince had gone to the main palace. The queen looked intently at her servant but said nothing. The maid was worried and did not know if everything would be okay. The queen sighed heavily and said that everything would be okay, as it was an informal audience, so her visit would not look unusual. The queen was very happy because she knew that her sweet daughter would cope well with everything. She knew that Paelamien, although the daughter of a concubine, was smarter than others, so she chose her for her retinue. Paelamien in turn was shocked. She shouted that the princess was still young, so she was not so far-sighted. Stelina looked at them in surprise. the prince said with a grin that his sister does not know when to speak and when to remain silent. Paelamian said with a grin that the young princess cannot distinguish reality from fiction. Stalina froze in shock. She didn't understand why her sister and brother were talking about her like that. She saw that now her sister had become a stranger to her. She was surprised and did not understand what had happened because she knew that her sister had always been on her side. She was in shock and did not understand how something like this could happen. Tarkin looked closely at his relatives. Tarkin understood perfectly well that the official audience with the representatives of the Empire would take place tomorrow, but if they found out about what had happened today, they would not miss their chance. He knew that the peace agreement had not yet been signed. They were currently walking on thin ice. Trade agreements, right of passage, right of use, and many other things, even if these were the words and actions of an immature princess. This time the Empire would try to use them as a pretext. He understood perfectly well that in such a case everything would fall on the shoulders of the queen, and that is why they tried so hard to smooth everything over. He understood perfectly well that the problem now was whose side his father took. Paelamian said with a nervous smile that this was not Irugo's position. Since the fourth princess was still young, she was not so far-sighted. Stalina huddled, not knowing what to answer. The prince looked at the princess with a smile and said that everything was correct and she should be generous. She looked closely at everyone present as she understood that now they would behave more quietly. Upon arrival in the kingdom, she did not even think of paying attention to their rude behavior. In turn, the princess just wanted them to be quieter. She turned around in surprise and looked intently at the king as she felt his gaze on her. She was surprised and didn't understand how long he looked at her. She sighed heavily as she understood that everything was going against her plan. She knew she had gotten the king's attention, but she didn't know if it was a good thing. She sighed heavily because she understood that she was still worth the attention that was removed from her. She knew that if she crossed the line a little, it would not become a problem of national importance. It would become a problem, but the princess of an enemy state reproached his daughter. She knew that she would now live in the kingdom, so contempt for the king would not play into her hands. She looked at the king with a soft smile because she knew that he did not need to worry at all because there was nothing to fear for. The king looked at the princess with a soft smile. Paelamian was shocked by her father's behavior. Aristina, with tears in her eyes, told the king that when she arrived, she had been insulted and had become very sad. She said that she was called a country bumpkin and despicable. She knew that this was not just a condemnation because of her background, but mockery. Paelamian, in turn, saw a distorted image of the king and princess. She was furious because she understood that if the princess told her father about everything now, a dirty war would begin. She wondered if she should take responsibility for everything. The young lady looked sideways at her sister and told her to slowly apologize to her sister. Stalina was shocked as she did not expect to hear something like this from her sister. Paelamian realized that they were making too many jokes about the princess while they were also susceptible to rumors and their own carelessness. She looked closely at her sister and told her to do everything faster. Paelamian sighed heavily. She knew she had made a mistake and she had to take her sister's explosive nature into account. But a moment later, the princess still asked Aristina for forgiveness with cold fury. Aristina looked at the princess in surprise and said that she thought she wanted to say something else. Paelamian looked at her sister in confusion, not understanding why she was looking at her like that and why she was studying her expression. Aristina looked closely at the young ladies and said that she thought they were saying something else. She remembered that they had said that she was of low birth. The princess was taken aback. She did not expect to hear anything like that. Paelamian looked at her sister closely and asked if this was what she called a sincere apology. She told her sister to give the princess a more worthy apology. Paelamian looked at her sister with cold fury. She wanted to get out of the hall as quickly as possible. Stalina froze in shock, looking at her sister because she did not expect such betrayal from her Paelamian. Looking at her sister asked if she did not want to admit the mistake, then would she like to explain herself now. Stalina in turn was shocked by her sister's actions, but a moment later she asked the princess for forgiveness in a trembling voice and also offered her sincere apologies. Tarkin looked at his sister in surprise as the sight was funny. He saw that the stubborn and arrogant princess apologized and also knelt down. Tarkin glanced sideways at the princess, wondering if she was enjoying the apology he had given her. He turned around with lightning speed and looked intently at the princess. He froze in surprise when he saw her face. He was taken aback because he noticed that she was happy. He understood that it was a little different from what he imagined. He assumed that the princess would look at him with tears in her eyes and say that all sorts of nasty things were being spread about her. She looked at him intently, and in her gaze one could read the question of whether he liked what skills she had. He looked at his future wife with a satisfied smile, as she looked like the one who brought the princess to her knees with just a few words. Aristina looked at the young man as she realized that he liked the performance. Now she realized that there were many disagreements between the step-relatives. She understood perfectly well that this could not be the end of it since she had to deal with this situation. She slowly stood up and approached the princess. Aristina sighed heavily and said that she had not expected things to turn out this way. Stelina looked at the princess in surprise, as she knew that she had never insulted her and had never asked for an apology. Aristine looked closely at the young lady and asked her again if she had anything else to add. She slowly extended her hand to the princess, as she felt uncomfortable watching the princess kneeling. Stelina looked at the young princess in surprise, as she realized that she was generous to her. She noticed the princess's patient and measured speech, but her cold gaze frightened her. Stelina saw that the young princess looked like her father. In turn, the king looked intently at the young princesses. He looked at the princess with a sweet smile as he realized that she was a very smart young lady. He understood that she was well aware of her position and skillfully used it. He understood perfectly well that this was a bold decision on her part. She acted within the bounds of decency, and nothing excessive was done on her part. He looked closely at the young prince and Ace and said that this was enough. He looked at them calmly and said that they had stopped standing and could sit down. He understood that they had suddenly appeared during tea time and had arranged a carnival. The young people whispered quietly among themselves. They were puzzled and did not know what was best to do. Ekaterina in turn shouted to her father that he was right. She looked at them in surprise and asked why they were doing this on such a happy day. She shouted that they had behaved rudely to the princess and had angered her sister. The young princesses backed away. They were confused and could not answer. Ekaterina looked at everyone present with the most innocent look and said that she was very sad. She said that they would soon become one family, but they had already managed to make a bad first impression of themselves. Ekaterina. She looked at them intently and asked what they should do if the princess completely misunderstood everything and hated them. Aristina was taken aback since she did not expect to hear such a thing. Aristina looked closely at the young princess. She saw that she had a fragile body and pale skin, and also noticed that the king and the young princess had the same turquoise eyes. Ekaterina, with a joyful smile, said that she was very glad that she now had another sister. Aristina, looking at the princess, realized that she was the queen's daughter, and therefore was Hamir's younger sister. Ekaterina slowly approached the princess and asked with a smile if she could call her Tina. Ekaterina looked at the young princess with a grin, waiting for her answer. Aristina in turn looked intently at the young lady without answering her question. Aristine thought for a moment as the second princess wanted to call her sister. Memories of the young girl suddenly came flooding back to her. The young girl screamed and called for her sister Tina with a smile. In the bright past, they once spent time together. Aristina remembered the old days with a smile. She was pleased to immerse herself in memories of her sister. A moment later, she returned to reality and, looking at the young princess, said that of course she could call her that. Ekaterina was very glad that the princess gave her consent. Aristina looked at the princess with a smile and noticed that she looked very much like her younger sister. Aristina told the princess that her sister was very beautiful and sweet. Ekaterina was amused by the fact that she looked like the most beautiful girl in the empire. Aristine knew very well that her sister was the most beautiful and sweet child. Even when she was a baby and watched her, she saw her superb beauty. Even when she saw her through the emperor's eye, while in captivity, she appeared to be very sweet and cheerful. Even when she was imprisoned because of her sister, she still seemed very sweet and kind to her. Ekaterina looked at the princess with a smile and asked if she knew anything about this dessert. The princess did not answer. With lightning speed, Ekaterina squeezed in between the young people. She looked sideways at her brother and his displeased face. The young princess knew that Aristine had entered into a political marriage without love, and upon arrival, she met rude men who smelled of blood. Anakarina, on the contrary, behaved kindly with the princess and reminded her of her home. She understood perfectly well that she was just a beautiful and sweet princess. She knew that it was very easy and simple to attract her attention. Anakarina looked at the princess with a gentle smile and called her Anakarina in turn, understood perfectly well that she had to be kind to the princess in order to appease her father. Anakarina looked closely at the princess and said that if she was not happy with anything in the palace, she should tell her because she could help her with anything. Aristina looked at the young princess in surprise and wondered if she could really help her with her marital debt. A moment later, her expression changed and she thanked the princess with a soft smile. Anakarina looked at the princess with a puzzled expression and wondered if she had just dropped formalities. Aristina was taken aback and asked for forgiveness, and also asked if she could speak informally. Anakarina was furious. She could not allow the princess to do something like that, but in turn she was puzzled, said that it embarrassed her a little. Aristina's expression sank after the princess's words, and she said that she thought that since they were now sisters, they could communicate informally. She asked if even in communication between sisters, it was necessary to maintain etiquette. She sighed heavily and said that unfortunately she didn't understand this well, and unfortunately she made a mistake. Anakarina was in shock and did not know how to quickly get out of this situation. She began to make excuses. Aristina looked at the young princess with a smile and asked if she would mind some informal communication. The young princess was furious. She wondered if the princess was only talking to the walls because now she didn't understand hints at all. Aristina looked at the princess and said that her younger sister always treated her with respect. Even at a very early age, she spoke formally to her. The young princess was in shock. She didn't know what to answer, while the prince in turn could barely contain his laughter. Anakarina looked sideways at her brother and called him. The young prince was taken aback and shuddered as he heard her voice full of malice. She looked at him intently and, holding back her rage, asked him what amused him so much. She wanted him to tell her too. Aristina glanced sideways at the king, who was conducting a casual dialogue. But a moment later, her attention was drawn to the dessert that stood next to the king. The young princess looked sideways at her daughter-in-law. She wondered what she was looking at. She wondered if the princess had seduced her father. But a moment later, she realized that the princess was seeing this dessert for the first time. She looked at the princess with a fierce grin because she did not know that if someone brought a vein to her father, he always gave it to her. Anakarina cried out with a joyful smile that she really loves jelly. The king looked at his daughter intently as he had just remembered this. She smiled and asked the king if he could give her his portion as usual. But a moment later, everyone froze in place, including the king. He looked at the princess in surprise as she handed him a fork with dessert. Everyone present froze in shock because nothing like this had ever happened before. She looked at the king intently and said that he should open his mouth. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked if she really wanted to feed him. The princess looked at the king intently and said that everything was correct, and she called him father. Anakarina was in complete shock. She wondered if the princess had gone crazy. She did not understand how the princess could call their dad father. Tarkin looked at everyone present with a smile and said that the ceremony had not yet taken place, but after the wedding the young princess would become their family. He did not understand why she could not immediately call the king father. He looked at his sister closely and said with a smile that it was strange to hear her say that when she had already addressed her as a member of the family. The young lady was taken aback, not knowing what to answer to this statement. Aristina, in turn, looked intently at the king and said that if he didn't like this, then she would correct herself. King Nephter stood frozen for a moment, not knowing what to answer, but a moment later, he left everyone without an answer and began to eat. Everyone present froze in shock, not understanding what they had just seen. They always saw before them the great king of metal and blood, always cold and stern, but now he was not acting like a strict king at all. A moment later, the king informed the young princess that she could address him that way. The princess looked at the king with a soft smile. Anakarina was furious. She understood that this was simply impossible. She looked at the young princess in surprise and wondered if she knew about the king's secret. At the same time, the king was enjoying a wonderful dessert. Everyone looked at them in surprise as they had never seen anything like it before. The young princess gave the king piece by piece. They were surprised because they saw that the king had already eaten several pieces. His children were confused because they did not know how much more he would eat. The young princess looked closely at the king and asked if his food was tasty. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a question, but after a few minutes he said that it was very tasty. The young man looked at his father in surprise, wondering if he had gone crazy. Tarkin was puzzled and did not understand what had happened to his greatness and authority, but the king did not answer and only looked away from his son. Aristina looked closely at the small piece of dessert. She knew that it was actually quite difficult to pick up, but still practice paid off. Earlier in the Empire, she saw her younger sister feeding the Emperor this treat. She watched everything that was happening through the Emperor's eye and tried to lift clay with a fork. In turn, the young princess always wanted to hear her father's praise. She knew that there were such times, but after she realized that the Emperor had always dreamed not of a daughter, but of the Emperor's eye, she abandoned her dreams. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback as she heard a crash behind her. Everyone looked at the young princess in surprise. Aristina was taken aback and said that her cup had suddenly slipped out. Sighing heavily, she said that it looked like the cup was not balanced. The young princess looked at the maid with fury and asked how she could boldly bring the cup without checking it first. Paola looked at the princess in surprise, as she knew that the girl who always took care of her appearance had just raised her voice. Aristina looked at the piece of jelly in surprise because unfortunately she was distracted and it fell. She sighed heavily, as she realized that unfortunately she would not have the courage to behave like that in front of her father. She sighed heavily because she knew that there was one secret, a secret that neither the servants nor even Tarkin knew. The young princess did not just want to eat, which is why she constantly begged for dessert from her father. The fact is that the king had one great secret. His right wrist was wounded. Although the wound did not affect his life in any way, but in wartime, it can easily withstand the turmoil. Everyone understood perfectly well that the injury could cause anxiety among the people and undermine the morale of the soldiers. For this reason, the king tirelessly continued to hide his injury, but since such slippery food as jelly could give rise to suspicion of injury, he preferred to avoid dessert. The princess always told her father with a happy smile that she would like to taste some jelly, and because of his injury, the king always gave his portion to his daughter. But everyone was whispering and talking about how the king had recently been sharing dessert with his daughter because she was very sweet and had managed to soften the serious king. She was glad because she knew that among all the princesses, he had always been more favorable to her. The men always whispered and said that the young princess was very sweet, and besides she was a reliable support for the queen. The young princess in turn was very happy since she could strengthen her brother's position, and everyone called her the king's favorite. She looked at the young princess with fury because she understood that she was very smart. Aristina glanced sideways at the princess, wondering if she wanted to protect the king's secret, she shouldn't just let her feed him. She sighed heavily as she understood that from Tarkin's point of view, who did not know about his father's injury, this could look a little unreasonable. Aristina looked at the king as she knew that there was nothing sadder than not being able to eat what you wanted when you were sick. She was worried and wondered if Russia would give birth to a king for treating him like a child. She sighed heavily as she understood perfectly well that unfortunately she had little contact with people and therefore could not know exactly how he would behave. In general, she knew little about people. She was puzzled and lost in her thoughts and conjectures, but the king in turn looked intently at the princess with a soft smile on his face. A moment later he said with a smile that although he had not initiated this marriage, he was indeed happy with it. He looked at the princess with a joyful smile and said that he must repay her for the amusement she had given him. He smiled and asked what she wanted. The young lady froze for a moment in surprise and shock. She realized that she was allowed to call him father, and he called her by a diminutive, affectionate name. She was glad because she understood that it had finally happened. He looked at her in surprise and asked what had happened. The king asked with a soft smile if such treatment had really shocked her too much. The young lady was taken aback and said that it was not that she sighed heavily, as she knew perfectly well that she should not attach much importance to this. She sighed heavily and said that she was just very happy it seemed to her that he really had become a father to her. The young lady sighed heavily and looked at the king with a joyful smile. She knew she had done well and was glad that she had regained her courage. She looked at the king with a smile and said that when he asked her if she wanted anything, he hit the nail on the head because she had one wish. Everyone present looked at the princess in surprise as they were surprised by her words. The king looked at the young princess in surprise and asked what she wanted. He asked if she wanted land or jewels. The young lady glanced sideways at her future husband. She was glad because she was finally able to reveal the true purpose of her visit. A moment later she looked at the king intently and said in all seriousness that she wanted to clear Irugo of its reputation as a land of barbarians. Everyone present froze in shock after the princess's words. Tarkin in turn froze in surprise looking at the young lady. She looked at the young man intently as she had now proven her skills to him. She knew that she was a contract that deserved to be sealed even without reading its terms. Sometime later the young people were returning to their place. Tarkin looked closely at the princess as he knew that everyone was shocked by her statement. In fact, she did not tell him anything about her plans on the way to the tea room. He looked at the young princess with a satisfied smile because he knew that if you really wanted something, you had to grab it. He looked closely at the young princess and asked with a smile if she could spare him some of her free time. She looked at the young man intently and said that she was busy. He looked at her in surprise but in turn asked her to spare just a couple of minutes. Aristina said with a playful smile that she would do it since he asked her so. Sometime later they sat and quietly drank tea. A moment later the young man sighed heavily and said that he agreed that she could be useful to him. Tarkin. He smiled and told her that the way his brother and sister acted out the scene was really a fascinating sight. The young lady was happy in her heart and agreed with him. He looked at her intently and she in turn wanted him to continue praising her. He looked at her intently and said that there was something else. The young princess flinched as she did not understand what he was talking about. She looked at him in surprise and asked with irritation in her voice if he hadn't seen how good she was. She asked if he hadn't heard what request she had for the king. He sighed heavily and looked away from her, said that it was in his father's interests and he didn't understand what he got out of it. The young lady in turn looked at him with cold fury. She sighed heavily and asked why he had called her then since she was so useless. Tarkin looked at her in surprise, but a moment later, sighing heavily, he said that he knew she had been crying. She looked at the young man in surprise, not understanding what he was saying. Tarkin sighed heavily and looking away from her said that when she first arrived at the palace, the royal offspring made fun of her. While eating dessert, she listened to him attentively and wondered why, in his opinion, she was crying. He sighed heavily and said that she was a princess anyway and was probably not used to such things. Having eaten the dessert with gusto, she asked her companion what if she was used to this kind of thing. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Tarkin looked at the young princess in surprise and asked if she really said that she was used to this kind of thing. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand why he suddenly became so serious. She looked at him intently and asked if he didn't know she was in captivity. Tarkin, in turn, froze in shock on the spot from her words. The young lady was puzzled. She wondered how he did not know about this. Since all the other members of the royal family knew, she was surprised since she knew that she was indifferent to him. She remembered that when she arrived at the palace, she had a vision through the emperor's eye. She remembered his conversation with the girl. The princess thought for a moment that he didn't like her because she was simply dirty. She looked closely at the young man as she now seemed to understand what he was worried about. Aristina sighed heavily and informed him that they were going to enter into a political marriage anyway, so they needed to mend their relationship. She looked at him intently and said she wanted to ask him straight out. A moment later she asked in all seriousness if he really wanted to start a war. Tarkin, taken aback, asked what she was talking about. She sighed heavily because she knew it would be better for him to answer her honestly. She knew that while they were talking, her father was preparing for war with all his might, and among her things there was a deadly poison, a poison prepared to kill Tarkin. Sometime later, the maids showed the princess's companions the palace. The young lady was amazed she did not know how even a barbarian state, which only knew how to fight monsters, created such art. A moment later, the young lady turned around as she heard the dialogue of her companions. The young ladies discussed Tarkin with smiles on their faces. They said he was attractive and not suitable for their pauper princess. The young lady told her friends with a grin that Tarkin would soon lose interest in the princess anyway, since she was still a savage who had spent many years in captivity. The young lady said with a smirk that as the closest servant to the princess, she must seduce her husband. She said with a fierce grin that she had to take care of her husband. A moment later, a knight ran up to them and called out to them. They looked at him in surprise because they did not understand what was going on. He cried out excitedly that the princess had gone to meet the king. The young maids were shocked when they heard the news. The lady shouted at the knight. She didn't understand why he didn't immediately follow the princess. The knight was shocked. He shouted that when he heard about this, she had already returned from the meeting, and now the princess was talking alone with Tarkin. The young lady was furious because she realized that their princess still did not understand her place. Tarkin, looking at the princess, told her that there are people who want war, but he is not one of them. She looked at him in surprise, but said nothing. A moment later, she sighed heavily as she did not want to continue the conversation on this topic. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she asked him about something like that. She sighed heavily and said that the thing is that the easiest way to win the war is to convince her. Tarkin froze in place in shock as he did not expect to hear something like that from her. A moment later, he looked at her with fury and told her that there was more than one way to win the war. She smiled and agreed with him and also said that by becoming a spy, she would be able to pass important information to the Empire. While eating dessert, she said that she could also lull him into a false sense of security and try to kill him, but she didn't know why she should take such a risk for an empire she had no good feelings for, and besides, the Emperor hated her with all his heart. He looked at her in surprise and asked if this meant that she had come here against her will. The young princess, with a radiant smile, told him that everything was true. She said that after investigating, he could find out that she had been kept in captivity for a long time. She knew that she had to tell him everything. Tarkin sighed heavily and fell into thought. He knew that this was not a topic that could be discussed easily, but he knew that the Emperor had forcibly isolated her. He understood perfectly well that there was a high probability that the wedding had been arranged for the sake of her death. The young princess looked closely at her companion and said with a smile that she did not want to die at all. She said that he also did not want to start a war, and their interests now coincided. He froze in surprise as he did not expect to hear such a thing. A moment later, the princess said that he was currently in a battle for his inheritance. He sighed heavily and with sadness in his voice asked if she really wanted to create an alliance to help him. She looked at the young man with a joyful smile because he understood everything. She smiled and told him that she would make every effort to keep him safe because the world depended on it. Tarkin is in shock because he now realized that the long dialogue about the trade union, about winning about everything, was to save her life. He sighed heavily, for he knew perfectly well that this was all a given, but he was confused and did not know how to treat her then. He saw that she was not at all worried about who her marriage partner was. He knew that marriage was an important point for reaching a peace treaty. He knew that even when she was being bullied, her too calm expression on her face was driving him crazy. He was furious and didn't understand why he was so angry at the Imperials. The young lady sighed heavily, for she had not spoken so much for a long time, and her throat was sore, and the constant smiling was taking a lot of her strength. She wondered if it didn't look strange that she was smiling so hard. She knew she had to smile to convince her interlocutor. Besides, today was the first time she had such long conversations. She wondered if it was good. She noticed that, unlike the first meeting, the young man now looked more gentle. She knew there was a bit of a pervert in him, but luckily for him, they understood each other. She considered for a moment whether she should act now. Aristina looked at the young man with a radiant smile and said that they could help each other for the sake of their common safety, calling him her partner. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she knew what the meaning of her words meant. She smiled and asked if he didn't know what a political marriage was, but he smiled and said that of course he knew what it was. A moment later, he shook her hand tenderly. She smiled and said that she thought their relationship would be good. Devoid of any love, she knew that they would be like business partners. Tarkin looked intently at the young princess but said nothing. A moment later, looking at her, he asked if she wanted something beyond this. She looked at him in surprise as she did not expect such a question. But a moment later, she excitedly said that she had a great idea for a business. The young man froze in shock as he did not expect this. The princess was taken aback and said that she did not have the entrepreneur's disease. She asked him not to look at her with such a close gaze because she was telling the truth. The young lady sighed heavily as she knew that her plan was indeed good. She knew that she should tell him more about it when he trusted her more. A moment later, she looked at her knight in surprise, who was flustered. The knights were taken aback, and looking at the princess, he cried out and called her. He was furious and did not understand where she had been, that she was returning so late. He shouted that since she had come to another country, she should behave appropriately. He was furious because he knew that because of the princess, he had received a severe reprimand from the maids. He did not understand what would happen to his reputation now. He understood that he had to scold her so that she would not leave again without permission. The young lady in turn froze in shock as she did not expect such a thing. But a moment later, she was taken aback as she found herself in the presence of her future husband. The knight looked at His Highness in surprise and asked in bewilderment why he was here. Tarkin looked at the knight with anger and said that he thought he heard something. The knight was taken aback and told the young man that these were just the internal affairs of the empire and he should not pay attention to it. He looked at the princess in confusion as he did not know what to do. He looked at the princess with fury and nervousness as he hoped that she would quickly calm her future husband down. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand why she had to do this. Tarkin looked at the knight with cold fury and a grin and said that he had just heard some words that concerned his bride. Tarkin looked at the knight with cold fury. Tarkin, looking at the trembling knight, said that a dog that bares its teeth at its master is useless. The knight was taken aback by Tarkin's gaze as he understood that his end had come. Tarkin struck the knight with cold fury a few seconds later. In turn, the knight flew head over heels across the ground. The young lady in turn watched everything that was happening closely. She appreciated the good blow of her future husband. Tarkin came closer to the knight and pinned him to the ground. The knight was in shock. He writhed and screamed that he was a knight in the great empire, and for this reason he would file an official protest. Tarkin sighed heavily and agreed with his decision. He turned around and looked intently at the young princess. Looking at the princess, he said that the knight was her faithful dog, so she had to make a decision. He looked closely at the young princess, wondering how she would handle this situation. The knight was in shock. He writhed and screamed as he was puzzled and agitated by Tarkin's behavior. He shouted furiously at the princess to tell her future husband to quickly remove his foot. He was shocked and did not understand why the princess was not in a hurry to pacify the savage. He saw that she was looking at them in confusion. He was furious because he thought that she was just stupid. The young lady looked at the knight intently. She was surprised that at such a moment he was able to think about such things. But she knew they always behaved this way. On the way, the knights mockingly discussed the princess. They saw that she spoke little and was not distinguished by intelligence, but she was obviously pretty and had a figure. They understood perfectly well that now she was a little dirty, but when she washed herself, everything would change for the better. They mockingly said that she would be grateful to them, and if such beautiful knights as they gave her their love, because she would soon have a marriage with a wild monster. The young lady was shocked when the knight looked into the carriage. He mockingly asked the princess for forgiveness because he did not know that she was going to change her clothes. He smirked and said that he should have opened the window later because he missed the beautiful view. The young lady was furious as she understood that the knight was now asking her for help. She came closer to her suffering husband and gently took his hand. The princess looked at the young man with a gentle smile. In turn, the knight was very happy because he realized that the princess would save him. The princess looked at the young man with a smile and said that husband and wife are one body and one business. Aristina. She looked at Tarkin with a grin and asked him to step on the knight again. Tarkin froze in surprise as he did not expect to hear something like that. The knight in turn looked at the young princess with bewilderment as he did not expect such a thing at all. Tarkin looked at her with a joyful smile and said that he would do everything as his bride asked. The knight was taken aback and trembled with fear, asked the young man to wait and not to jump to conclusions. But Tarkin did not listen to his whining. He came closer to him and with their cold fury struck. Sometime later, the knight was sitting against the wall, completely beaten. Tarkin looked at his subordinate intently and told him to take the knight to the dungeon. The young lady thought for a moment and remembered how she touched her fiancé's hand as it was very strong. She looked at him intently, as she knew that since he was a warrior, he could easily deal with knights. She looked at the young man with a joyful smile because she now understood him. She knew that he enjoyed beating others. She respected his tastes because thanks to him she also enjoyed the moment. She looked at him intently because she knew that he was a very good person, although a pervert. A moment later, the young man felt some kind of sinister look on himself. The young lady walked slowly into the room and stood there in surprise for a moment, wondering if this was her new bedroom. She knew that although she would only be using it until the wedding ceremony, everything in it was perfectly tidied up. It seemed to her now that she was truly welcome in such a place. She knew that others said that she came to the kingdom to die, but she was really glad that she was marrying by convenience. She knew that it would be nice to have tea and desserts with her future husband next time. A moment later, the maid came closer to her and called her. The princess looked at her in surprise and asked if it was really her name that she had called. The maid was furious as she had called the princess many times, but she had not answered. The maids whispered quietly among themselves. They realized that all of Irugo's maids had left the room. A moment later, the maids surrounded the young princess and asked her angrily if she wanted to explain something to them. Aristina looked at the maid and asked if she understood the barking of dogs. The young lady was taken aback as she did not understand what he was talking about. The princess, she said with anger in her voice that, of course she did not understand this. She was perplexed and did not understand why the princess was asking such a thing. The lady looked at the princess with a sneer and asked if it was because she couldn't communicate with people that she had mastered the language of dogs. She said with a sneer that they were really on the same level. The princess sighed heavily and told her maids that they could not be dogs either. The young ladies were taken aback by shock. They simply could not believe that the princess would tell them something like that. The young lady looked at the princess with anger and asked what she just said. Aristina knew perfectly well that they were not even on the same level as dogs, since they had no sense of duty, no trust, and even dogs were cuter in comparison. Aristina looked closely at the maids and said that at first she thought she heard the dog barking somewhere, but this happens so often that even dogs are not capable of such a thing. Palace companions are formed from ladies who come from high aristocratic families. They differed from ordinary maids and courtiers because they became interlocutors for the imperial persons or assistants in business. Only noble and erudite girls from high aristocratic families could become companions, but those from inconspicuous families were ordinary ladies. Entering the abandoned palace as a princess, they only giggled a little, plundering the budget. The lady asked the princess with cold fury if she had forgotten the words of the emperor. She asked the princess what the emperor would do if he knew about her behavior. The young lady sighed heavily as today had been a very busy day for her and she was very tired. She wanted the ladies to leave as soon as possible, so she agreed with them. The young lady looked at the princess with her fury as she did not understand why she was nodding absent-mindedly. She thought for a moment, because the princess was always like this no matter how much she was scolded or reproached. She was careless and could not understand anything. Even when her holy clothes were trampled by dirty feet, even when her food was laced with rubble, she was a fool whom I could only blink my eyes at, not understanding anything. The lady knew that if her family had more money, she would not be babysitting the princess now. She looked at the princess with fury and told her not to forget her duties. The princess looked at her with bewilderment as she did not understand what she was talking about. She looked at the princess with a grin and asked if she had forgotten. She mocked the scene and said that the role of the princess is death. The princess froze in place for a moment and was taken aback without saying a word. The girls looked at each other in surprise as they did not understand what was being discussed. The lady was furious. She understood that in front of her now was a princess who constantly blinked her eyes, but now she suddenly expressed her protest. She wanted the princess to nod quickly because she knew everything well. The princess looked closely at her companion and said that she was mistaken since they were now in another country and not in the empire. The young lady froze in shock as she did not expect to hear anything like that. She realized that her dreams were shattered into pieces. The young ladies were furious, for they understood that the princess was proud. Only because of this, they were afraid that it was true, but she really did not understand anything. The princess sighed heavily as she understood that they could not even be dogs. She said that they had no idea how they should behave in the future. The girls looked at each other, puzzled and frightened. They were surprised that the princess interrupted them. They did not expect such a reaction from her at all. The princess looked at them intently and asked with a smile what she should do with them, since she only took in well-behaved dogs. She asked with a grin what they usually did with wild mongrels. She looked at them intently and said that they were becoming trophies or prey for a predator. The young ladies were shocked. They asked if she was really making fun of them. They kept shouting that they would definitely report everything to the emperor. They shouted furiously that no one loved her and no one would support her. She sighed heavily and, looking at her companions, said that they were stupid after all. She looked intently at the young lady, who in turn was taken aback. The lady was shocked. She called Lady Rosalind so that she would already tell the princess something. She was furious and asked Rosalind, was she really going to let the princess get away with everything like that? They shouted and called for Lady Rosaline, but the lady stood dumbfounded. Rosaline in turn wondered if all those blinking eyes in response to mockery and reproaches were just an act, and this was how she covered her claws. Rosalind now understood perfectly well that the princess was simply using the mask of a fool, flawlessly deceiving everyone. Aristina looked at them intently and said that dogs understand human speech. They are smart, and if they are told to sit, they sit. If they are told to wait, they wait. She wondered where she could find such a dog. Rosalind slowly approached the princess and looked at her with cold fury in her eyes. She trembled with rage as she looked at the princess, but a moment later, everyone present froze in shock. Aristina, in turn, also looked at the companion with bewilderment. Rosalind knew perfectly well that the princess was deceiving everyone perfectly, but all this time it was she who mocked the princess the most. She understood perfectly well that if she were dumped into the hands of a princess in a kingdom where she had no connections, she would have no choice but to bark in order to survive. The young ladies were shocked as they saw Lady Rosaline barking like a dog. The princess looked closely at the lady as she realized that she was now pretending to be with the dog. She looked at the young lady with a smirk, as she could not have predicted this. Aristina looked at the girl with a grin because she saw that she changed her position very quickly. She understood that if a person is in danger, she can pretend to be a dog. Aristine looked at the girl closely and with a gentle smile said that it was very sweet of her. She was glad that she now had her own dog. Rosalind, looking at the princess in response, barked. She knew that if she took on a job, then she needed to do everything carefully. The young ladies stood behind her in shock. The girl was shocked and did not understand what the young lady was doing. The girls looked at the young men with bewilderment. They were in shock. They did not understand what was happening at all. At the same time, the princess was playing with her new dog with a smile. Aristine, with an innocent smile, told the lady that she turned out to be very nice. Rosalind was furious. She understood that she had no other choice and she had to pretend to be a dog. She understood perfectly well that even though she had become a cutie, nothing could be changed. She understood perfectly well that if after her words she did not adapt to the princess, then everything would be in vain. She looked at the princess warily, but a moment later she started barking again. She knew that in order to survive, she was willing to pretend to be a dog for as long as it took. The princess looked closely at the young lady and said with a grin that she wanted to raise her to be a hunting dog. The girl looked at the princess with caution and surprise, as she did not understand what she was talking about. A moment later, she turned around and glared at her friends. The young ladies were taken aback. They did not know how they could bow their heads before the inadequate princess. She sighed heavily as she understood that people who did not understand the whole situation were looking at her as if she was crazy. Rosalind looked at the girls with a smirk, as she preferred being a hunting dog to being cute. She wanted to bring back a trophy that her owner would want. She understood that when she caught all the game, she would have only one goal left. She knew that her last hunting trophy would be the princess, because she wanted to deal with her when the time came. The princess looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she wanted to see her hunting skills, but for now they could have fun in other ways. Rosaline was puzzled because she knew it was all in vain. She was furious because she knew they would never forget. Such a disgrace. At the same time, the young man continued to train on the training ground. He was furious because he remembered how everyone in the castle criticized his future wife. He understood perfectly well that he had never been ashamed of his origin, but he felt unpleasant when they insulted her. As he trained, he dealt blow after blow with fury. He understood that marrying into the imperial family in whose veins pure gold was said to flow was the king's obvious intention to compensate for his political weakness as an illegitimate child. He sighed heavily as he understood perfectly well that the struggle for the throne was becoming more and more serious, and this battle could not be avoided. Durant came up to him and called him. Durant informed Tarkin that all the warriors had already gathered and they needed to go to the conference room. As they left, they heard all the figures crumble to pieces with a crash after Tarkin's training. He entered the hall and all those present bowed politely and greeted the prince. Walking to his rightful place, he accepted greetings. A moment later, he looked sharply at everyone present and said that they could begin the meeting. The young man looked at the prince intently and said that they could begin the report on the monster's corpse found yesterday. For some time, they tirelessly discussed all state affairs. The young man looked at the prince intently and asked why they didn't do a major cleanup before winter came. He asked the prince if he wanted to neglect the management of the plane because of the war with Silnus. Everyone present looked intently at the prince, waiting for an answer. The man looked at the prince intently and asked what kind of person the princess was. He said that no matter how much he questioned Durant, he did not answer anything. The men looked at them excitedly. They wanted to know everything about the princess. Durant looked at everyone present and told them that they should watch their language as she was the future wife of His Highness. Everyone was furious. They asked whether they now had to choose their words when talking about the Sylvanians. They asked in anger whether in a state of war they had to tolerate those scoundrels. Tarkin sighed heavily and told everyone to behave quietly. A dead silence fell over the room after his words. Tarkin looked at Jacqueline intently and called him. Tarkin asked the young man if he had found out why the princess was isolated. Tarkin said that the princess had told him that if he searched a little, it would be easy to find out the facts. Jacqueline, in turn, was taken aback and froze in place, not knowing what to say. He sighed heavily and, bowing guiltily, told Tarkin that before the princess's arrival, he had come to him to make a report. The young man hesitated, but a moment later informed Tarkin that he himself had said then that the report was good kindling material, and for this reason, he still burned it. Tarkin looked at his assistant in surprise and asked if this was true. Jacqueline, with tears in his eyes, shouted at the prince that he had also threatened him. Jacqueline trembled and shouted at the prince that he had threatened to burn him for firewood. Tarkin sighed heavily and said that it seemed like everything was true. He asked his assistant not to cry as he could wet the carpet. Tarkin told the young man that from now on he should not put off news about the princess, but should report it to him directly. Jacqueline looked at Tarkin with surprise and confusion. He wondered if the prince really liked the princess. Tarkin looked at everyone present and said that although the war with the Empire was over, it was the most important key, so it would be good to know everything about it. Everyone present froze in shock as they realized that their prince was very smart. Tarkin, looking at everyone, said that he could not find Mukali. The young man said that General Mukali had gone on an inspection tour of the Western Front line. He said that arrangements had already been made so that the general could return through the main gate. The young man said that the general was still not used to life in the palace. Tarkin asked them to let him know when the general returned. Tarkin knew that most knights could not get used to life in the palace. Tarkin, looking at everyone present, began to speak. The men looked at him warily. The young man sighed heavily. He understood perfectly well that they were still in the process of negotiations with the Empire, but because Togo was currently discussing a peace treaty, they were not too relaxed. The man looked at the prince intently as he knew that they would accept any order he gave them. The prince looked closely at his subordinates and ordered them to contact the cook who was skilled in making cakes even if he was from another palace. The men told the prince in unison that they would do everything, but a moment later they froze in place in bewilderment. Opening her eyes, the young lady saw that it was already a beautiful day. She sighed heavily as she realized that she had slept like a log. She was a little puzzled because she knew that she had not slept for a long time, clean in clean clothes and on a firm bed. She did not want to get out of bed at all because the blanket was soft and the bed was warm. She froze in surprise looking at the bed as she saw that it was returning to its original state. A moment later, she rose up with lightning speed and sat on the bed, but froze in surprise when she saw her future husband. She was surprised and looked at him as she did not expect to see him so early in the morning. While drinking tea, he asked with a smile if she was having fun. She looked at him in surprise and greeted him. She knew perfectly well that she had to be careful during daylight hours, but she was puzzled because she thought that the maids would come to her. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing there. Tarkin asked with a smile why she was asking. He asked if a husband really needed a reason to come into his wife's bedroom. The princess was surprised, looked at him and said that they were not married yet. He smiled and asked if after the wedding he would be able to come to her whenever he wanted. The princess looked at him in surprise and calmly said that this was not so, and she did not expect him to have free time at all. The prince was taken aback as he had never heard anything like this in his life. She said that he should have just woken her up and not waited around doing nothing. She asked if he really didn't have his own things to do. The prince sighed heavily, holding back his rage as he was about to wake her up. He was Eros and wondered why he hadn't done it. Initially, when he came to her, he first waited for her outside. But the maid told him that the princess had not yet woken up. He was surprised and did not understand how she could sleep for so long. Tarkin, in turn, assumed that the princess was very small and must have been very tired after a long journey. Sometime later, he decided to go to the training ground, but with his appearance, the ground suddenly turned into hell. Sometime later, a report on the work was brought to him. After he had finished his business, he returned to the princess again, but the maid again reported that she was still not awake. The prince was in a bit of culture shock. He was puzzled and did not understand how it was possible to sleep for so long. The maid looked at the prince with a happy smile and called him. She smiled radiantly and informed the prince that the princess had a habit of fooling around, and unfortunately it was a bit problematic. She looked at the prince with a joyful smile and asked if he would like to have a cup of tea with them before the princess woke up. She smiled and said that unfortunately she did not yet know about his preferences, but still hoped that he would like everything. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile whether he should add sugar and cream. He looked at the maid with their cold fury. The prince looked closely at the maids as he realized that they were the same companions who had mocked the princess when she first arrived in their kingdom. He was furious as he knew that the ladies of the court were standing before him, unnaturally blocking his path. He wondered if they had been mocking her, and the poor princess was now sitting and crying, calling for him. With lightning speed, he ran into the room of the young princess. The maid was in shock. She did not understand how he could break into the room of a sleeping lady. She screamed that even though he was a prince, he shouldn't have done something like that. For a moment, the prince froze in surprise when he saw the princess sleeping quietly. He was surprised and puzzled as she was fast asleep in bed. He slowly turned his gaze away from the princess as he realized that no one was making fun of her and she was simply quietly basking in bed. Aristina looked at the prince in surprise as she did not understand why he looked away from her. She was confused and didn't understand why he had just become embarrassed. She realized that there was a man sitting in front of her looking at her, unable to wake her up. She looked intently at the prince and called him. Aristina looked at the prince with a radiant smile and asked if he couldn't wake her up because she looked like an angel. She smiled and asked if that was why he was embarrassed. The prince froze in shock as he did not expect to hear something like that from her. She looked at him intently with bewilderment because she knew that he had quietly made his way to the curtain of her bed and covering it with tea was secretly looking at her. The prince was shocked. He could not utter a word. The young lady said that she of course respected the tastes of other people, but still asked him to refrain from carrying them out on her. He shouted that he had not planned to do anything like that to her. A moment later, he handed her an envelope containing documents. The young princess slowly opened the envelope and froze for a moment. The prince looked at her with a smile and said that he had brought her a list of the aristocrats who would be attending the event to celebrate the arrival of the delegation. He said that she needed to know their names before her afternoon audience with the king. The princess looked at the documents with a gentle smile. She understood that most likely he should not have provided such information to the princess of an enemy state. But she was glad of the fact that he trusted her with such information. She knew that it was very good, and in this case she needed to justify his expectations. She said with a smile that they should come not in advance, but at the exact chosen time. The prince said that he supported her in this. He sighed heavily and said that otherwise they might run into the royal offspring and be an eyesore to them. The princess smiled and said that she was talking about something else now. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She smiled and said that they needed time, and there were things to take care of before the audience. She looked at him with a playful smile and said that they should eat first. Madame looked at the maids and asked if they had introduced everyone according to their titles. She was furious and shouted at everyone as she knew that there should be no mistakes. After all, this was a very important event. Sometime later, all those present were informed that His Highness Tarkin and Princess Sylvanas had arrived at Aristina with the delegation. The prince looked intently at his companion and said that they would enter together, but only she should represent the delegation. The lady smiled and told the prince that he need not worry, and she called him her partner. A moment later, they slowly entered the hall. Everyone present froze in shock. The royals looked at the princess and prince with fury. The princess and the prince walked slowly through the hall. At the same time, the young ladies barely whispered to each other as they realized that the rumors were a lie about the princess. They were surprised because they saw that the princess was truly beautiful. The young princess slowly approached the king and greeted him. He smiled and told the princess that she had come a long way and greeted her. The queen looked at the princess intently and said that she had heard that her journey had been long. The queen looked at the princess with a smile and asked if the journey had been too difficult for her. The queen said she was very worried because the princess had decided to use old-fashioned carriages rather than the portal. Aristina looked at the queen in surprise and intently. Tarkin told the princess that when he was 10 years old, mercenaries came to kill him, but they failed, so he was sent to the front to fight the monsters of the plains. The princess looked at him in surprise and asked if this was really the queen's order. He sighed heavily and said that it was exactly like that. While the king was busy with foreign policy, the queen was strengthening her position in the palace, and the queen was supported by the conservative aristocrats who occupy high positions, and on his side now are wars, and the new aristocracy that occupies small positions and positions. The princess was surprised by everything that was said. She understood perfectly well that the queen had sent the young man to the battlefield to die. She understood perfectly well that the queen would not be afraid of any means or methods to put her son on the throne. She saw that the queen seemed very gentle on the outside, but if you look deeper, she was not like that. The queen said with a smirk that the portal had been locked for many years of war, but it had been opened again. She asked with a smirk and told the princess that she was not a despicable girl who was not allowed to use the portal. The princess looked closely at the queen, for she knew that when she had gone to meet the king, the royal children had praised her, knowing how dirty she had been upon arrival. She sighed heavily, knowing that this was the royal family's style, but it wouldn't work on her. The young princess said with a smile that she had set out on a journey to stop the rivers of blood that were flowing in the war, so it didn't matter how difficult the path was. She didn't care. She looked at the queen and said that because of the war, the common people of both countries suffered. For this reason, as a princess, she wanted to check everything with her own eyes, and she herself saw the life of the people in comparison with her. Her physical pain is insignificant. The queen looked at the new princess with a smile in turn. She was burning with anger and wondered if the princess was laughing at her since the princess was allowed to use the portal. The king looked at the young princess with a smile and said that it seemed that the emperor had raised his daughter well because she herself decided not to use the portal. Everyone present began to whisper that the princess was very kind, and in truth, if she had no reason to do so, she would have gone through the portal. The man, grinning, looked at the princess and said that this was a great happiness. He told everyone with a satisfied smile that he thought that since she was a princess, she would act arrogantly, but she turned out to be an easygoing person. Skila said that he was deeply touched by the princess. The young man looked at the count in surprise and said that this was too much on his part. He looked at the young man in surprise and said that this was a great thing. He looked at the princess intently and shouted that if Anna did not want to show herself at her best, she would have put aside her pride and appeared in the attire of their kingdom. Everyone present froze in place as they were so enchanted by the princess that they did not notice the obvious. The aristocrats were surprised. They saw that she was dressed in their traditional attire. They were surprised and did not understand why she did this, since she brought many outfits with her. The young lady sighed heavily as everything happened as she expected. She looked intently at the Count, for she knew that he was the Queen's father and the prince's closest companion. In fact, her maids also told her this. They shouted that she represented the Empire and should be wearing Empire clothes, but after a month on the road, her dress was very dirty and she could not wear it. The Count said with a smile that this was probably the princess's new style, and after winning the war they decided to look good. The Count shouted that the Imperials were still arrogant because they sent them not only tribute, but also a beautiful princess. He shouted that the princess was part of the imperial family, and they understood everything perfectly well. The prince looked at the Count with fury in his eyes because he had spoken so recklessly about tribute. The Count smiled and told the princess that she was a very deep thinker and insightful for her age. The young lady in turn was a little irritated. She wondered if this was too much of them. Everyone present mockingly said that the Imperials dared to attack their kingdom and even took away part of the territory. For this reason it was so important for them to send the princess to them, but they believed that the Imperials should have sent them a second princess who was called the Jewel of the Empire. The young princess stood quietly and listened to their conversation. She understood perfectly well that all the Queen's people were very hostile to her future husband and to herself. She understood that with just a few words they were able to cross the line. She had the impression that they were just waiting for the moment. She heard them roaring with laughter. The princess looked at everyone present and said that it was very strange because the princess standing in front of them was ending the long-standing hostile relations between the states, and in order to establish peace, she told them that she had arrived in a carriage and was wearing their traditional attire, and they were making statements that were undermining the meaning of peace. She looked at them with a smirk and said that it sounded as if they wanted to start a war. The Count was taken aback. He looked nervously at the princess and said that her words were very dangerous because they had just recently signed a peace treaty. With a nervous smile, he asked how he could allow himself to say such words. Aristina looked at him with a smile and agreeing said that he had not even had such an intention. He sighed heavily as he realized that trouble had just almost happened. The Count smiled and said that he was very glad that they had cleared up this misunderstanding. He understood that if he went further, he could be accused of disobeying the king. He looked closely at the young princess, as he had previously thought that she would tremble with fear like an ordinary girl, but he noticed that she had nerves of steel. The man tensed up because he saw the princess's intense gaze. He did not understand what she was doing. He didn't understand why she was looking at him with such an intent gaze. It seemed to him that she was waiting for an answer from him. Aristina looked at the Count with a smile and said that he had said earlier that she was wearing the outfit of their kingdom. He looked at her in surprise as he did not understand what she was getting at. He smiled nervously and said that the outfit suited her very well. The young princess in turn sighed heavily. A moment later she informed him that her expectations of him as well as his of her had been too high. She sighed heavily and looking away from him said that she had overestimated him too much. The Count was shocked as he did not expect to hear something like that from the princess. He was furious because she dared to judge him. He knew perfectly well that the princess was without pedigree and was simply a nobody. He screamed in rage and asked what kind of outfit she was wearing. Pailamian looked closely at the princess and informed her that her dress was made of Silvatian's Carial silk. The Count was taken aback when he heard the princess's words. He looked at the young princess in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Pailamian told the Count to take a closer look. Aristina looked at the princess with a radiant smile and said that she was right in her judgment. Aristina all smiled and said that her country was very proud of this silk, and in honor of this silk a whole country was named because it was of high quality, and it also had a pure shade of red, but it did not become part of the tribute. Everyone present was shocked by the princess's words. The Count was in shock as he understood that he had already failed. He looked closely at the princess as he realized that her outfit symbolized the unity of the two countries. The princess looked at the Count with a grin as she realized that he had fallen for his own trick. She received only one outfit from the emperor. It got dirty and worn out on the way to the kingdom, but fortunately for her, the hyenas did not know about it. So before the audience, she quickly took it and asked her future husband for a favor. They did not have time to sew the dress, which is now popular in the empire, since it took a lot of time, but still fortunately in the clothes of the kingdom, enough attention was paid to it. She looked at the count with a special smirk as she wondered if she should thank him for reacting the way she wanted. Aristina looked at the king with a smile and said that this silk was originally a gift for the king. She smiled and asked the king to consider it a wedding present for her. The king froze in surprise as he did not expect such a thing. But a moment later he laughed and agreed with her. He said that this would be his gift for her. He said with a smile that a gift with a deep meaning would suit her very well. He looked intently at everyone present, and changing his expression, told everyone that among all those present, only one princess was thinking about peace and the future of the two countries. All those present backed away, for they feared the king's wrath. The king smiled and told the princess that she must be very tired. He invited her to sit down. The prince and princess exchanged glances. The prince looked at the young princess with a smile and said that she had exceeded his expectations. A moment later, a maid came up to them and, trembling with fear, called out to the prince and princess. Aristina looked at the maid because she did not understand why she was trembling so much with fear. The maid bowed low and asked their forgiveness, as due to one mistake they did not have enough chairs, so she could not lead them to their place. The young people looked at the maid in surprise, as they did not expect such a thing. The king looked at the queen with fury and called her. The queen looked at everyone present in surprise. She said that it seemed that her chief maid had made a mistake. The king looked at her in surprise and asked if she hadn't checked everything before the celebration. The queen sighed heavily and informed the king that it was her mistake, for she was excited by the fact that the war was over and the old hostile relations were no more. The prince and princess looked closely at the king and queen, for they knew that the queen was lying now. The queen was excited, looked at them and asked what they should do now since they only needed 2 chairs. A moment later, the queen pointed to an empty seat and informed them that they could sit there. The young people were taken aback, as they knew that things were bad, because the queen wanted to seat the prince and princess in the most insignificant place of all. There were only places for servants there. The king looked at the queen with anger, but she asked him in bewilderment what had happened. She told the king that they could no longer force people to stand because it might give the impression that they were being punished. The queen looked at her husband with a smile and said that these were just some chairs, and he should not attach any special importance to it. She smiled and said that the princess was not so petty as to destroy the peaceful atmosphere because of something like that. Turning around, she looked at the princess and asked with a smile if she was speaking correctly, but a moment later the queen froze in place in surprise. She was shocked because she gave the princess the farthest seat and she was happy about it. The queen was shocked and wondered if the princess knew in advance that she had lured the head maid to her side and was preparing a counterattack as compensation. The prince looked at the young princess in surprise, as he did not understand why she was so happy. He looked at her nervously because she worried him a lot. The prince was puzzled because his instincts screamed that when she had that expression on her face, something dangerous was happening. Now the past flashed before his eyes. He was worried because he knew that she could do something. The prince, with the speed of lightning, took the princess by the arm and, looking at the queen, said that the reception had not yet begun and she already looked drunk. The queen looked at the prince in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The prince looked at the queen and said that otherwise she would not have seated the princess in the most remote place, because the princess herself could be called a symbol of peace, and he could not believe now that the queen wanted to seat such a person in the most insignificant place. The prince looked at the queen with a grin and asked if she was already suffering from something other than drunkenness. From his words, one could understand that he was almost directly asking if she had gone crazy in her old age. Everyone present was in shock as they understood that the prince had just declared himself in front of the entire high society. They were shocked as he was an eternally silent young man, but now he showed his fangs. They were surprised because they realized that all this was for the princess. The queen was taken aback and looked at them nervously, saying that of course she didn't mean it that way. She said that from the outside it might look like they were making the princess stand because she had done something wrong, so she simply offered her a free chair. The prince glanced sideways at his sisters and asked if anyone would like to give up their place to her, since they were all highly respected members of the royal family. The young princesses tensed, not knowing what to answer. The prince looked angrily at the young ladies and said that he believed that for the sake of peace, they could free one chair, but with his look, he said that they must leave immediately. The princesses were in shock as they understood that their end was coming soon. The prince looked at them with a smile and shouted that for the sake of peace, and for the sake of the beautiful princess, he would of course give up his place. Tarkin thanked his brother with a smile, and from the bottom of his heart, Tarkin looked at his bride intently and said that she could come and sit down, but a moment later, he looked at her in surprise as she did not respond. She looked at him intently and informed him that this was not enough because the husband and wife should be close. She looked closely at the young prince and knew that everything was right because her business partner was trying so hard for her. She knew that they had already gone very far and she could not allow them to seat her fiancé separately from her. The young princess was very positive because she wanted to secure a place for her future husband. The young princesses tensed up because they saw that they were coming. Stelina was very excited and trembled with fear because she was well aware that she had previously teased the princess very much and now she could easily take it out on her. She was worried and didn't know what to do and wondered if she should give up her seat for the princess right now because she knew that in this way she could save her honor, but she was worried that the queen might notice. She was furious and didn't want to lose her dignity in front of everyone. But in turn, the princess simply passed her by. Stelina looked at the princess in surprise as she did not understand why she did this. Aristina smiled and said that they would soon become a married couple and therefore should sit next to each other, and their marriage contract is a symbol of peace. She looked closely at the young princess and said with a smile that she had heard her say earlier that she was extremely happy about their wedding. Yenikarina in turn was taken aback by the shock. She was puzzled and did not know what to answer. Aristina was well aware that the request to sit in someone's seat also had a political subtext, but there was no point in her touching the pacifier. She knew that her goal was to be the most influential member of the royal family in the absence of the first prince, Hamir. Aristina looked at the young princess in surprise and asked if she really didn't want to do that. Yenikarina was furious, and of course, she didn't want this. She didn't understand who would want to give up their place to such a fool as the princess. Yenikarina, trembling with fear, said that this was not the issue at all. Aristina looked at the princess with cold fury and anger. As her mother, the queen, started all this, Aristina understood perfectly well that she had to take revenge on them. Yenikarina was shaking with fear. She understood that the princess who was now in front of her was simply crazy. She was in shock because she understood that he was husband and wife, one Satan. The king looked at everyone present and said that her daughter had a sore leg, and it would be better for her to sit on a comfortable chair. The princess looked at the king in surprise as she had not expected anything like this at all. Yenikarina looked at her father with great joy because she knew that he would stand up for her. Yenikarina looked at the princess with a smile and said that everything was correct, but she in turn really wanted to give up her place to her. Aristina understood perfectly well that the young princess was the king's main favorite, and given the situation she should not expect him to take her side. Yenikarina said that she had a very fragile body. She asked her sister with a flirtatious smile if she understood this. Aristina looked closely at the princess as she saw that she was larger in build than she was. Aristina told the princess that although Araosta was not feeling in the best shape, everything was fine. The queen sighed heavily as she was glad that her daughter was not hurt. The king looked closely at the young people and said that the spouses should still sit together. He smiled and said that as his son had said earlier, there was one way to make room for them. He looked closely at the maid and told her to bring more chairs. The maid agreed, but she was puzzled because she did not know where to put them. The king smiled and said that she didn't need to worry about it. He said that she could put them right next to him. The queen was shocked. The count in turn was very excited. He shouted to the king that this was simply impossible. He was puzzled and excited as he knew that the seat next to the king was only reserved for the crown prince. The queen looked at her husband with excitement and shouted to him that the count was absolutely right. She shouted to the king that he himself knew perfectly well that law and order must reign in the royal family. The king laughed at her words. He looked at the queen and said with a grin that they were just chairs and they could have just put them in the empty space. He looked at the queen and said that they could do nothing because she herself had made a mistake with the number of seats. She sighed heavily but did not answer him. A moment later, the young people, arm in arm, walked towards the place. At that moment, not only the people who supported the queen but also the neutral aristocrats balancing between the two brothers were deeply shocked. The young princess was the center of everyone's attention. She looked at everyone present intently and in surprise as she noticed that from above, everyone looked very small. She was glad because from this position she could easily survey the entire hall. The prince looked at his bride in surprise and asked if she was really looking for someone. She looked at him in surprise as she had not expected such a question. Tarkin said that when the queen gave her a distant seat, her gaze was directed somewhere to the end of the hall. He moved closer to her and whispered softly in her ear. He wanted to know who the man she was looking for was. He wanted to know who the man was. The princess froze in place for a moment. She looked at the prince intently and said that it was a business secret, and also asked him not to approach her so abruptly because he had frightened her. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. A moment later, he sighed heavily and said that he felt like she didn't want to tell him about it. Tarkin casually informed her that if her idea didn't cause any problems, then he didn't care. She looked at him in surprise and sighed heavily. Since he did not start asking her about everything, the princess looked intently into the distance and saw the very same man because she had previously seen him through the Emperor's eye. A month ago, on the way from the Empire to the kingdom, she saw the future while collecting water. The young man looked intently at the princess and said that even though he was a non-entity, he still wanted to be hers. He hoped and begged her to accept him. She looked at him with a joyful smile and said that he would now be hers. He looked at her in surprise and asked if everything would be okay because she knew everything about him. She said that he didn't need to say such words because she understood everything perfectly. She said that he would become the best in this country and even in the entire continent. She knew that he would become the best blacksmith, and she would help him achieve his goal. She sighed heavily as she remembered a piece of her little vision. To be honest, she was a little surprised. Then seeing such a picture being a bride, initially this image seemed to her like an excerpt from some novel. However, the young princess was very glad that they unexpectedly met at the banquet. The prince in turn caught the eye of the young man at whom the princess was looking intently. He looked away from the young man as he was very displeased. The lady in turn understood perfectly well that the blacksmith would become the main workforce in her business. She really wanted to talk to him right now. But she knew perfectly well that she had already made a great noise today, so she had to sit quietly until the end of the party. She knew that the queen was looking at her with fury. The young lady looked closely at the blacksmith and was taken aback when she saw that his hand was fine. But in the future that she recently saw he was crippled as he was missing the thumb on his right hand, she was puzzled because she still did not know what kind of relationship there had been between them. Then she did not understand why she stood her ground so confidently. The young princess in turn really wanted to prevent the tragedy before it was too late. She sighed heavily and began her meal, but was still lost in her thoughts and decided that she needed to find out about the young man after the banquet was over. But a moment later she was taken aback and came to her senses as she had eaten a wonderful dish. She was shocked because the structure of the meat was very juicy and sinewy. A small piece melted in her mouth. She looked at this dish with admiration. A moment later the maid brought them some jelly. The young lady in turn was very happy. She ate the wonderful dessert with pleasure. A moment later, the young princess was taken aback as she noticed with annoyance that she had eaten everything very quickly. The prince sighed heavily and pushed his dessert towards her. She looked at him in surprise, but he informed her that he did not like the dessert. She was surprised but still asked if she could eat it. Then, he sighed heavily and said that she was free to do as she wished. She looked at the prince with a smile as she was pleased with his courtesy. She looked at him with a smile and said that although he was a bit of a shy pervert, he was still a great partner. The young man was taken aback as he did not expect to hear something like that. He asked what she was talking about. She said that he was a very good partner. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she had said before. A moment later, he sighed heavily and said that it didn't matter anymore. The young ladies looked at the prince and princess with admiration and surprise. They were amazed because they realized that the young people looked very beautiful together. The ladies wanted to start a conversation with the princess after the banquet. Diona could not stand their conversation and silently left her friends. She was furious and didn't know how their relationship could change in an instant. She was in shock, didn't understand why only she should feel awkward. She ran through the palace in anger, but a moment later she collided with someone and screamed. She fell to the ground but looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not know who she had collided with. A moment later, she looked at the knight with a smile. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked what had happened to her as he saw that she was in tears. He asked excitedly if this was all connected with the prince. The young lady was taken aback, not knowing what to answer, but a moment later she burst into tears again. She sighed heavily and said that the gentleman was bothering her a lot, and she was also worried about the fact that his future wife was interested in another man. The young man looked at the girl with anger and asked what she was talking about. After the official meeting between Irugo and Sylvanus, the gloomy palace of Tarkin came to life for the first time in a long time. This happened not only because the princess turned out to be elegant and beautiful, but also because of the incident in which the queen was humiliated. The girls were delighted with the princess. They saw that the princess and the prince were very suitable for each other. Everyone was looking forward to their wedding. The princess knew that the kingdom produced a large amount of high-quality steel. She wanted to connect the blacksmith she had found with the metallurgy of the kingdom. At the same time, she could fulfill the king's wish and get rid of the stigma of being a barbarian country. A moment later, the princess was called by a maid. The princess looked at the maid in surprise as she was very happy. The maid asked the princess if she had heard that her wedding dress would be made using Sylvanian fabric and the traditions of Irugo as at the banquet. Aristina still thought that her efforts were not in vain. The maid told the princess that the designer sent her sketches. She wanted to ask the princess which one she liked. The young lady sighed heavily because she knew that the outfit would be in Irugo's style. She mockingly told the princess that she called such an outfit a symbol of peace. The maid was shocked by the lady's words. Rosalind screamed at her with rage and asked how she could speak so disrespectfully about the princess. Rosalind was furious because the girl laughed at the princess's achievements, and she did not understand how the lady could be called her maid. They argued very loudly for some time, and the maid shouted angrily and said that if they wanted to continue arguing, they should do it outside. The princess sighed heavily as they continued to quarrel. Aristina knew that she was now living a peaceful life. The chambermaids were arguing among themselves, so they did not have enough time and energy for her. Her nights were replaced, and she also ate well and slept well. After the maid had driven the ladies away, she informed the princess that a wedding only happens once, and that it was not the princess's fault. She asked the princess what she wanted. The maids looked at the young princess intently and told her firmly that she must tell them and they would do everything. She looked at them in surprise as she saw that they were trying too hard, but a moment later she still said that she had something. They looked closely at the princess and asked what she wanted. She smiled and said she wanted something soft. She smiled and said she wanted something soft to put her in a better mood when she went to bed. The prince, in turn, froze in surprise in place near the princess's door. The maids looked at the princess with confusion and admiration as she had exceeded their expectations. She looked at them in surprise but still said that she didn't want a wide one, but one that wasn't too narrow wouldn't work either because no matter the size, there would still be room. The young maids understood perfectly well that the prince and princess would sleep in each other's arms. The prince was stunned by the princess's words. The maids happily told the princess that they would go away to find the perfect thing for her. As she left, the maid said with a joyful smile that the master would also be surprised, but she froze in surprise and shock when she saw the prince in front of her. The princess looked at the prince intently and said that he could come in. At the same time, young ladies were fighting in the street. The young man slowly approached them. They looked at the young man with fury as they heard him say something to them. He looked at them intently and with fury. The young ladies were taken aback when they saw the knight. He looked intently at the young ladies and said that they must tell the princess that a general wanted to visit her. The young ladies were shocked as they did not expect to hear such a thing. They knew that the general was the closest person to Prince Tarkin. They froze in surprise because they saw his terrible scars on his face, and they also heard that he was afraid of the soldiers because of his monstrous physique. He looked at them with cold fury and asked why they were still looking at him. He said that they had to lead him. The maids were taken aback because they did not expect such a thing but still agreed with him. They were puzzled and did not understand why he needed the princess. The general looked at the ladies with contempt as he saw that they were cowardly. He thought that their mistress was the same. He understood perfectly well that his friend did not throw words to the wind. He remembered her brother, who was also a devoted warrior. He was so devoted that he was willing to sacrifice his life for everyone. One fine day he told the prince that he would become bait to catch the monsters. The general knew that the young man was a very loyal and handsome young man. Chantra looked at the general with a smile and said that if something happened to him, he should take care of his younger sister. The general was puzzled because he knew that something irreparable had happened to his friend. For a moment he thought because he remembered the girl. She said that she only wanted happiness for the prince. She sincerely wanted the prince to find a good companion and live happily. She was very excited then, as she assumed that the princess would soon get married, but she already had another man in whom she was very interested. The young man was furious as he knew that they could allow such a thing. A moment later he angrily hit the wall with his fist. The young ladies were shocked as they did not expect such a thing. He understood perfectly well that if the princess was liked by everyone, then her admirers were hasty. He was furious and didn't understand how Diana was any worse. The general was furious. He wanted to quickly find evidence and reveal the truth about the princess to everyone. There was a famous experiment called Pavlov's dog. It consisted of ringing a bell before each meal. Only at the sight of a bell will the dog start salivating. Although the princess was not a dog, she knew that since the prince had come, there would soon be tea. She knew that if they brought tea, they would also serve desserts with it. She was glad, and she was interested in what they would bring today. She knew that if she asked the servants, this issue could be easily resolved, but because in the princess's mind this territory was the prince's property, she felt that it would be rude to ask someone to satisfy her desire. She wondered if she should watch herself. She knew that when the prince ascended the throne, she would finally be free from the danger of being killed by father's mercenary, and with her capital she would be able to confidently acquire what she wanted. The prince looked closely at the young lady. He knew that they had only decided to become working partners. He sighed heavily and said that he had heard her conversation with the servant. She looked at him in surprise but still said that she had explained everything clearly since she liked it when it was soft. He looked at her in surprise and wondered if she had singled that out on purpose. He was in shock and didn't understand how he should take it. She looked at the prince coquettishly and with a smile, and Amain asked if he knew this. The young prince was taken aback as he did not expect to hear such a thing. With the speed of lightning, the prince rose from his chair and told her that he would not do this to her. He was very excited and embarrassed, and with the speed of lightning he decided to leave the princess's room. The maid looked at the prince in surprise as she did not understand why he was behaving in this way. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was leaving already. The princess wondered in surprise what he wouldn't do. She sighed heavily and said that everyone was acting strange today. The maid, puzzled, said that she had just brought tea, but it seemed she was very late. The princess, in turn, was not upset because in front of her was a beautiful and exquisite table. She was glad that she could eat several portions of exquisite desserts. The young lady, in turn, slowly began to eat, but suddenly, unexpectedly for everyone, the maids ran into her room and hurriedly shouted that something bad had happened. They excitedly shouted to the princess that the general had come to her. They were surprised and puzzled because they did not know what to do. They said that the general persistently asked to be brought to her, so they had no choice but to quickly come to her. They were excited, looked at the princess and said that she must quickly drive him away. Aristina thought for a moment, since she had not heard of the general before and had not seen him at the banquet. After long stories from her maids, she understood who they were talking about. Looking at them, she still decided that they should invite the general to come to her. The maids were taken aback and froze in shock. But still, some time later, the young general came to the princess. He came closer to her and introduced himself with a grin. He also said that he was the prince's general. He looked at the young princess in surprise as he had assumed she was very small. He understood perfectly well that now she would be dumbfounded and then she would scream with horror in her voice. Although he was very disgusted by this reaction, he knew that the scar would play into his hands today because he came to the princess to warn her. He was furious and even wanted to threaten the princess since he could not watch her looking at other men. Aristina looked at the general with a smile and greeted him. The general froze in shock. The princess said with a smile that he seemed to be the prince's man. The general froze in shock and stared at the princess, not understanding what was happening. He was puzzled and did not understand why the princess was so sincerely happy, because he had deliberately used a menacing tone and had come with a weapon. Besides, he noticed that she didn't wince at all when she looked at his scar. He was furious, and he knew that it didn't matter at all now. He looked at the princess with cold fury and said that he had heard that she had recently been asking about another man. The young princess, with the most unperturbed look and a radiant smile, said that everything was correct. The princess asked the general if he wanted to sit down since her neck was already hurting. The general froze in shock, staring at the princess as she commanded her maids. The princess thought about her fiancé for a moment. She knew perfectly well that she was at a banquet. He asked her why she was showing interest in this man. He really wanted to know why she was looking at him so intently. She sighed heavily as she understood perfectly well that unfortunately she could not tell him, and only answered that it was a business secret. But she understood that in order to find out more about the young man, she needed to explain everything to her groom and also to unite the forces. However, after the reception, her fiancé unfortunately became grumpy. For this reason, she had no choice but to turn to the servants, but to her regret, her inquiries bore no fruit. But she was very glad because just in time her fiancé's servant appeared before her. She remembered how her fiancé was a little shy at the banquet. She sighed heavily and thought with an innocent smile that her fiancé felt emotionally guilty about that time. The general looked at the princess with surprise and bewilderment, since he had not planned at all to sit and drink tea with her. He was confused and didn't understand what was going on and why he was sitting with her. He was shocked and didn't understand how this happened, so he eats some sweet cakes with Princess Thumbelina. She looked at him intently and with an innocent smile asked if he would help. The general looked at her in surprise. She smiled and said that he should help her find a man. The general was taken aback as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The princess looked at him with an innocent look and asked if he would not help her. He sighed heavily and refused the princess. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She was puzzled and did not understand what kind of answer he had given her. He hesitated, not knowing what to do or what to say. The general was shocked because without noticing it, he had fallen into the princess's trap. He was puzzled and did not understand why he should help her look for a man. The princess looked at the general intently and asked whether he would help her or not. The general was furious. He knew perfectly well that he had to make her realize reality. He shouted furiously that she had to kill something in her little head. The princess froze for a moment in surprise as she did not expect such a thing. He shouted that he had come to her today. She froze in anticipation of his continuation of words, but the general in turn froze in place, rooted to the spot. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked why he had come. The general backed away and began to hesitate with his answer, because suddenly he had a nagging feeling that had always saved him on the battlefield, telling him now that he should not be angry at all. He was puzzled and did not understand why he had such a feeling. He sighed heavily and realized that he didn't need to be angry right now. A moment later, the perfect idea came to him. He wanted to pretend to help her and then catch her red-handed. He understood that then he would have irrefutable evidence in his hands, and in that case, no words would save her. In turn, the princess looked at the general in bewilderment. A moment later, he changed his position and, smiling at the princess, said that he had come to help her find out about that man. She looked at him with a smile and said that it seemed so. The princess thanked the general for his help. He smiled and said that there was nothing to thank him for. He was glad that she didn't suspect anything. He thought that most likely it was because everyone was coddling her. She looked closely at the general and said that she was just thinking about what she should do and how. Since she was not yet very limited in her actions, she said that unfortunately she could not send away the maids, but she could still go outside alone and meet him. The young man looked at her in surprise and puzzled and said that she could continue the conversation. A moment later, the princess said that the servant had told her everything about the young man, but unfortunately there was still much she did not know. She wanted to know what he likes and what interests him. The general was shocked. He did not understand why she was interested in such things. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he was asking about this. The general was taken aback because he remembered that he had to cooperate with her. He knew that first she had to fall for his cooperation, and then he would catch her in the act. Aristina said with a joyful smile that the thing was that she wanted to lure him. The general could not stand it and fell to the ground with a crash. The princess looked at the general in surprise and asked if something was hurting him. The general sighed heavily and said that it was not so. He was furious because he knew everything but did not understand why his mood had changed so suddenly. He was furious because he knew perfectly well that he had found out her secret, and that should have given him satisfaction, but it was the opposite. With tears in his eyes, he asked furiously how she could leave their prince. The princess smiled and said that it was not that at all. She said that the man had a different talent and was in excellent physical shape, unlike the prince. The general was taken aback and asked in surprise if she really wanted to say that the prince was in poor physical shape. The princess smiled and said that he was not in bad physical shape at all. He was just good at something else. The general was shocked. He shouted at the princess to stop as he did not intend to listen to nonsense. She looked at the general in surprise because she did not understand why he was inconsistent in his decisions. She understood that he belonged to that class of people who considered their commander to be the strongest man in the world. She sighed heavily because she didn't want to talk about the prince in a bad way. She understood that she just needed to embellish it a little. She smiled and said that she thought the prince was a great partner who was not inferior even physically. The general was shocked by the princess's words. The general was in shock. He understood that his commander was not yet married but was already moving very quickly. He understood perfectly well that little girls like the princess needed to be fed twice as much as an ordinary person. He did not understand how the prince could touch her. Aristina smiled and told the general that the young man was a blacksmith. The general looked at her in surprise because he did not understand what she was talking about. She smiled and said that the prince in turn was a beautiful warrior, but that did not mean that he was better than the prince. The general looked at the princess with bewilderment. He was puzzled and did not understand what was being discussed. The princess smiled and said that there were many excellent blacksmiths in the kingdom, and she needed just such a one. She frowned for a moment as she had not intended to say that she needed a blacksmith. She glanced sideways at the young man as she knew that he was sent by the prince, so there should be no difficulty in digesting such information. The general, in turn, froze in bewilderment. He did not understand why she spoke about this so abruptly. The princess smiled and said that in order for the kingdom to be able to withstand the ever-increasing number of monsters, an outstanding blacksmith must forge an even more outstanding sword. Aristina told the general that the kingdom had no equal in metallurgy and smelting of metals. Such magnificent art testifies to the history of battles of the kingdom and the monsters of the Great Plain. Looked at her in surprise and said that he did not think that the princess knew about such facts, but she turned out to be aware. Aristina smiled and asked how she could not know about this. She said with a smile that she had heard before that the sword of the kingdom could cut through the skin of a monster with one blow. Mukali asked with a grin, "Is it really just skin?" He said that if you put an aura on the sword, you can cut through bones too. He also said that only the sword of their kingdom can withstand such a load. The princess was amazed by the incredible fact. The general said with a smile that the Imperials could only squeak about how their ancient swords were barbarism. The princess said that the Imperials know that the famous sword is incredibly good. They just don't want to admit it because they are all proud. The general smiled and told the princess that he completely agreed with her. The princess smiled and said that the Imperials were very proud. A moment later, the general was taken aback. He was a little confused and did not understand what he had just said. He was in shock because he knew that he had only had to pretend to be kind to the princess in order to get closer and then catch her in the act. Aristina looked closely at the sword behind the general. Mukali in turn beamed with happiness as she noticed his excellent sword. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if he also had the kingdom's famous sword. He looked at her in surprise, but at the same time, the general was embarrassed. A moment later, he said with a playful smile that he had such a sword, and with the speed of lightning, he drew it from its sheath and cut through the air. The princess froze in surprise for a moment. The general's sword was the longest of all for this reason. When it was drawn from its sheath, a strong wind current was formed. The general was in shock. He understood that he was finished. He was shaking with fear because he could not utter a word. He was puzzled and excited because he only wanted to show the princess his favorite sword. He looked at the princess, who had a whirlwind on her head, with a puzzled expression. Mukali was puzzled because he understood that even if she stopped pointing her finger at him and called him a barbarian, he would not be able to do anything to counter it. The general was in shock. He himself did not notice how the conversation about the sword had excited him. He understood perfectly well that if someone saw them now, then everyone would think that he was a bandit who was torturing the little princess or intimidating her with his weapon. He remembered that his friend always grumbled and warned him not to draw his sword from its sheath. The young man told the general that no matter what his intentions were, because of his appearance, he could seem frightening. He understood that the princess would now scream in fear. True, his original plan was indeed to scare the princess, but he didn't want that now. He looked at the princess with fear as she did not make a sound. He sighed heavily because he just wanted to show her his favorite weapon. He understood that he had made a huge mistake, and now he wouldn't even talk to the princess about weapons. The princess looked at the sword with admiration. She saw that it was very polished. She said that you can look into it like in a mirror. The general froze in shock and surprise as he did not expect such a reaction. She looked at the weapon as if enchanted because she saw a clear pattern there. She was glad because she had never seen such large swords up close before. He looked at the princess in surprise and asked in a trembling voice if she was okay. The princess looked at the general in bewilderment and asked why he was asking her such a question. He hesitated and looked away from her, not knowing how to answer the question. He remembered how on the battlefield they called him a beast and asked him to show his terrible face. They mockingly asked him if he was a man or a beast. All the knights shouted that he was disgusting. In the war with the Imperial Knights, he constantly received a charge of mockery in his direction, but they did not embarrass him or shame him because no matter what anyone said, he received his huge scar in a fierce battle. However, the general really could do nothing about the disgust shown towards him. At first, even his girlfriend shuddered at the sight of him. When every time he appeared, the swarm began mocking and crying, he realized everything. Unfortunately, he could not be near his small and defenseless ones. For this reason, he thought that the little princess would also immediately swallow her tongue out of fear. But both at first and now, he could find neither fear nor disgust in her eyes. The princess looked at the general intently and asked him in a calm manner how he dealt with rust. He was surprised as she asked him such a question as if he were an ordinary person. The general was amazed because she was looking at him intently with her eyes. He realized that most likely it was curiosity on her part, or the look of a researcher. Mukali saw that she was not bothered by her scar. Her look said that she was only interested in the sword. He was surprised and amazed by the princess, as he did not understand why she was asking how to deal with rust, when in fact she was the princess of the empire. However, he still answered her with a smile. The general said that he takes care of his sword several times a day. She looked at the art with admiration and told the general that it takes a lot of effort. The general said that he does it because the sword is worth his care. Aristina looked intently at the general and asked if she could touch the sword. He looked at the princess with embarrassment but still asked her to be careful and not to get hurt because his sword was very sharp, so she could get hurt just by touching it. The general smiled and told the princess that his sword was very big, so the owner's body was strengthened while wearing it. The princess looked at the general with admiration as she learned a lot of new things. The general in turn told the princess about everything with interest. The princess looked at the general with a smile because she realized that he talked a lot when he talked about his sword. Now she realized that he really loved it before she always learned through the emperor's eye, but this was a funny and interesting experience for her. The young princess listened to the general with one ear as she had the feeling that she had forgotten something very important. A moment later she screamed as she remembered what she had forgotten. Mukali, with lightning speed, assumed a defensive posture. Mukali looked sideways at Aristina in bewilderment. He knew perfectly well that just now there was nothing dangerous around them. Aristina looked at her cup of tea puzzled and upset as she noticed that it had cooled down. Mukali was shocked. He did not expect this. He was shocked and wondered if it was the tea that made her look like that. She sighed heavily as she was waiting for the tea to get warm to drink it, but unfortunately, it had gotten cold. The general was shocked. He understood perfectly well that the princess could ask the maids to bring new tea. But a moment later he realized that the maids were frightened because of him. She sighed heavily, for she knew that she would be able to try the tea during the prince's next visit. The princess told the general with a smile that it turned out that she had been too focused on his story and had forgotten about something important. But this all happened because their dialogue was too interesting for her. The general froze in shock and surprise as he did not expect such a thing. He looked at her intently and said that in that case they could have tea at his house. Aristina looked at the general in surprise. The general looked away from her embarrassed and asked if she would like to come and visit him. He said that if she didn't want to, then there was nothing to worry about. The princess joyfully shouted that she wanted to and they could go right now. She understood that she could go to visit because she was invited. The princess was sincerely glad about this, since when she was in captivity, she could not even dream of such a thing. But still, she was excited because she didn't know what to do when someone was coming to visit. She had heard before that you can't go empty-handed, but she knew that unfortunately she didn't have anything now. But a moment later, she turned around and looked closely at the dessert table. The general thought for a moment he knew that he was doing everything for the sake of surveillance for the princess and from a close position. The young lady mentally asked for forgiveness from her fiancé. She was confused and wondered if this would be okay. She looked at the general intently and said that in that case she would take the cookies. He looked at the princess in surprise and wondered if she would really want to take that very cookie. The general was taken aback. He wondered why he had just remembered the prince's strange recent decree. He realized that the prince had done everything for the princess. She looked at the general in surprise and asked if he didn't like cookies. She said that they were very tasty here, and recently they had become even tastier. The general was taken aback and shouted that that was not the case at all. The maid screamed furiously that they must immediately take the flowers and move them to another place, since the princess would be getting out of the carriage at that place, so nothing should block her path to the ceremony. The maid ran up to the girls with lightning speed and asked what they were doing when everyone was so busy. She looked at the young girls in surprise as they looked at her with tears in their eyes. She was puzzled, did not understand what had happened. The girls burst into tears. They said that in their lives as makeup artists, they would never be able to create such beauty again. The girl froze in place in surprise and embarrassment when she saw the princess. The princess looked at them intently and said that they were constantly exaggerating, and this time they even started crying. Everyone present was in shock, and they shouted to the princess that she was beautiful. They said with joyful smiles that the prince should also look at her beautiful and wonderful appearance. They told the princess that it was time for her to go since the carriage was already ready. Brody looked at the princess with a sneer and said that now she understood why everyone says that they judge a book by its cover. She asked with a smirk if this outfit would not harm the greatness of the empire. Rosalind looked at the princess as if spellbound, as she had already been admiring her outfit. She was shocked as after calculating all the expenses on her image, she realized that it cost an entire palace. She came closer to her and looked greedily at her dress. She asked the princess for permission to be her friend. The maids of the kingdom stood in front of the princess with a smile. They happily said that there was no need for this, and the princess did not need to be entrusted with such a burdensome role as her companion, because they could do everything themselves. The maid looked closely at the princess's companions and said that they seemed to be very tired, but for their greater comfort they had prepared pearl carriages and the most exquisite treats. The princess looked closely at the maid and said with a smile that her ability to appease the maids with the help of climbing was excellent. The princess noticed that the prince's servants were very smart because they immediately noticed that her maids were careless and arrogant. But unfortunately, it was difficult for ordinary maids to stand up to aristocratic ladies, but the general's visit could have been the trigger. Because after his visit, her maids began to do the work of ordinary maids. Although she was grateful to them, she knew that the decision to stand up to the aristocrats was not easy for them. The maid looked at the princess with a smile and told her not to look at her with such a respectful gaze, because she would soon become the mistress of the palace. She looked closely at the princess and asked if she knew that before the inhabitants of the kingdom were constantly in a state of unrest, because the longer the war with the empire lasted, the longer the master was absent, and for this reason they were not prepared to confront the lands of the monsters. Unfortunately, the others pretended to be unperturbed, but inside they were shaking with anxiety, as they did not know when the monsters might invade. The maid smiled and said that for this reason for them in a similar situation, the princess became a symbol of hope and peace. The young lady in turn understood them perfectly well. She assumed that her father might now act immaturely. Walking towards the carriage, she suddenly froze in place when she saw the knight. The knight looked at the princess mockingly and blocked her way. He himself said mockingly that she looked completely different until she washed herself. Even after dressing up, she became a beauty. The princess sighed heavily but did not answer. He said mockingly that she had repeated her sister's hairstyle. He said that he had a very good sense like a knight, and for this reason he quickly recognized it. She looked at him casually and said that he was a fine fellow. A moment later, the knight mockingly asked her permission to see her off. He extended his hand to her and said that she should answer, but the princess in turn departed, not intending to dance to his tune. She turned and walked towards the carriage. The knight froze in shock, as he had not expected such a thing. She sighed heavily as she knew that he was not worth the ceremony at all. The young man was furious. He did not understand why the princess behaved so rudely, but a moment later he suddenly froze as he heard his comrades laughing at him. He was furious and did not understand how she dared to disgrace him in front of the others. He was very angry because he understood that the savages dared to turn up their noses in front of him. He understood perfectly well that they should be grateful that such a handsome and high-ranking knight was in front of them. The princess sighed heavily. She understood that the knight below had already received what he deserved, but this young man still could not calm down. She understood perfectly well that after the end of the wedding ceremony, most of the members of the delegation would leave, but still several knights from the guard would remain, and he was one of them. She was worried because she knew that one day the news would reach the ears of the emperor. She was worried that one day the emperor might find out that she was not being bullied as he ordered. She knew that she had to deal with the knights quickly. The ladies whispered among themselves as they saw that the newspapermen were everywhere. The ceremony was far from over, but the atmosphere was very lively. A moment later, the young ladies were dumbfounded as they saw the generals and even the strategist. They were shocked as they were able to see the 3 wings of His Highness Tarkin. Steel sword. Mukali sighed heavily as he felt uncomfortable without his sword. Genius Judicalan looked intently at the general and informed him that he would not have to fight anyone today. Durant, in turn, wanted to see the prince in his wedding attire as soon as possible. The young lady looked closely at the young men as she realized that they were incredibly popular. But a moment later she was taken aback because she did not know where Madame Dion was. The lady knew that the young lady always walked with the knights and all the young ladies always envied her. Diona looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if she was really looking for her. A moment later, she greeted the young ladies with a smile. The ladies looked at the young lady as if spellbound because she was their standard. The young lady sheepishly told Dion that she looked charming today, and they asked her if she would turn out to be more beautiful than the princess. Diona looked at the young ladies with a smile and said that they should not say such things at the prince's wedding. She smiled and told them that when they met the princess they would realize that she was much more beautiful. They looked at her closely and asked if she would like to go to the prince, as the groom's room was on the opposite side. Diona flinched. They looked at her in surprise and asked what she had just said. They looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she would go to the bride's room to see the princess. Diona, embarrassed and timid, told the young ladies that the princess had come to a land unfamiliar to her, so she would be lonely and uncomfortable here. She said that they had met on her very first day at the palace, and besides of all the girls, she was only familiar with her. The girls began to whisper. They were puzzled and did not know what to do, because it seemed to them that the princess had called some young lady of her own. They guessed that she knew about the relationship between the lady and the prince. After the war, the prince and his entourage returned to the capital. For this reason, many ladies began to circle around the prince, but in the end, they all had to give in. Because the prince had the perfect girl by his side, no one was able to approach him. The Palaman family represented. The rumor of her brother's glory was still on everyone's lips. Diona was the only lady the prince allowed to be near him. But unfortunately, due to the royal order, this relationship did not bear fruit, which was the assessment of the secular society of the kingdom. The ladies knew perfectly well that it was a political marriage, and no one could do anything about it, but they were furious and could not understand how the princess could dress up in a wedding dress and disgrace the young lady. Dion intently and in a rush, they shouted that she did not need to worry as they would support her. They shouted that she did not need to be discouraged and she should fight. She looked at them in surprise as she did not expect why they would express their support for her so abruptly, but she still thanked them with a smile for such words. They looked closely at the young lady, for they knew that she was very kind and gentle, but they were puzzled and afraid that the princess might offend her. A moment later, she glanced sideways at her princess companions and informed her friends that she had to go. They shouted that if something happened to her, she must tell them. Sometime later, the young lady came into the newlyweds' waiting room. I thought for a moment and felt sad. Since she had imagined herself sitting behind this door since childhood, she sighed heavily because she knew that she could not do anything about it, since it was the king's order, and unfortunately political marriages are not uncommon among aristocrats. A moment later, she entered the room with the princess's permission. The princess looked at the young lady in surprise. Diona was stunned by shock on the spot. She looked closely at the young princess and introduced herself and said that they had met briefly. She sighed and said that she remembered the young lady as she had brought her tea recently. The princess looked at her intently and asked what brought her to the newlyweds' waiting room. Diona was furious, but in order to hide her emotions, she, without noticing it, dropped her head very low. She was shocked because she noticed that the princess had become even more beautiful since their last meeting. She understood perfectly well that she needed to keep her emotions under control. Even when the prince's coldness and indifference pierced her soul like thorns, even when she thought she was breaking into pieces, she always kept a smile on her exquisite face. She sighed heavily as she realized that the prince would never change. She looked closely at the princess with a gentle smile, said that she came to her to congratulate the two of them on their wedding. Looking at the princess with tears in her eyes, the young lady said that they were perfect for each other. A moment later, her eyes could not stand it, and she bowed low. The princess in turn looked at the young lady with bewilderment, but still thanked her. Diona shuddered as she did not expect such a thing. She looked at the princess in surprise and wondered if that was all she was reacting to. Diona knew that during the banquet she had not looked like a person without intelligence. Diona. Looking at the princess, she said that she and the prince grew up together because His Highness's mother was very close to her mother, and the same was true between her brother and the prince. Then the young lady realized that they would have a relationship that would not become strange even after marriage. Then she sincerely believed that this was her destiny. She said that when she visited the royal palace as a child, the prince's mother showered her with her love, and the prince always took care of her and appreciated her. She looked at the princess intently and said that she must have been through something similar before, but initially the prince did not allow any lady near him because of his coldness. Diona said that they had known each other for a long time, so everything was different between them. Diona told the princess that deep down he was very good. Diona understood perfectly well that as long as she was here, the princess would never win the prince's heart. The princess sighed heavily because, to be honest, she sat quietly and did not interrupt her speech, but for her it was really very boring. She understood perfectly well that it didn't matter to her whether the young lady had a special relationship with her business partner or whether she was his lover. What was important was whether this relationship would become her trump card in future negotiations. She asked the prince with a smile if he wanted to spend a hot night with his beloved, and if he decided to expand the capital business, she would give him a divorce. In this vein, she wanted to use their relationship. The young princess understood perfectly well that this was a card that she would be able to play after the prince became the crown prince, and she destroyed the emperor's plans, but she knew that this was still a long way off. Diona looked at the princess with a smirk, as she understood that she had become superfluous to her due to her unexpected intrusion. She looked at the princess in surprise as she was thinking about something completely different. The princess sighed heavily as she knew that if she reacted to the boastful story about the guy in any way, it would be hard to survive in society. Diona sighed heavily, and looking at the princess said that in fact she really could not imagine her marriage with Tarkin. The princess looked at the young lady in surprise as she did not understand what she was talking about. As she saw that the lady suddenly began to speak more caustic, the princess looked sideways at the girl as she felt hostility from her. Diona said with a smile that there was no subtext in this. It was just that their countries had been in hostile relations for a long time, so she had no idea that such a wedding was possible. The princess looked at the girl as she saw that she had very quickly gotten out of this situation, but now she was alarming the princess with each new word. In veiled words, the young lady told the princess that she loved the prince very much, but for the sake of peace, he married her. Before leaving, the emperor's eye awakened memories in the princess. The emperor looked closely at the young princess and said that when everything was ready, he would send her a sign. He said that she should drink the poison when she received it, but if she could not do this, then she should give the poison to the prince to drink. The emperor shouted furiously at his daughter that this was a royal duty, that only she who had no abilities could fulfill. The emperor shouted that she must become the spark of war. Aristina thanked Dion and also said that she would live in a successful marriage. As she wished, Dion shuddered as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Aristina told the girl that she also seemed to share the general view that this wedding was not an ordinary union between a man and a woman, but a union for the sake of establishing peace. For a moment there was dead silence in the room. Diona looked at the princess with confusion. She was furious because she understood that she really could drive a person crazy. The young ladies stood and chatted among themselves. The young lady sewed and began to talk about new news about Lady Dion. Durant glanced sideways at the young ladies. Mukali looked intently at his friend, and with irritation in his voice asked what he was looking at, since he knew that they needed to hurry and go to the prince. The young man sighed heavily as he unfortunately did not hear the end, but he understood that they were clearly talking about Dion. A moment later he informed his friend that he would be leaving for a short while. Mukali was in shock as he knew they had to hurry. The general shouted to his friend and asked where he was going. Mukali was in shock. He knew it was terrible, but he didn't know what to do. The general was shocked because he knew that Durant was really looking forward to the moment when he could see the prince in a suit. He was surprised because his friend said that he would go somewhere before meeting the prince. He did not understand that this had suddenly happened. The general sighed heavily as he knew that all this did not bode well. The general was in shock because he understood that he had to clean up everything. Everyone thought that he was crazy, but in fact Durant was responsible for the madness in their company. For a moment, the princess and the young lady stared at each other in silence. Diona looked at the princess with fury because she was able to bring her to this. She looked at the princess intently and wondered if she meant that this was not just a marriage but a union of a higher order. She was furious because she knew that she was the prince's destiny. After all, they had a fateful first meeting, and it was she who was next to him during the most difficult periods of his life. She knew that the death of her brother made their relationship even stronger, and besides, she is in close relations with the union of three. From her point of view, the princess asked her if she really thought that the wedding would be different because of the bride. The princess, with a smirk, told her that if the prince married her, the wedding would not have much meaning. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that the marriage was ending hundreds of years of struggle. She knew that a grand wedding union for the sake of peace would soon take place. She knew that the wedding was coming soon, which attracted the attention of the whole world. Just because it was a union between a prince and a princess, it was already special. The young lady was furious because she knew that she would never be satisfied with the prince. She understood that it had already come to the wedding, and there was no turning back. She was furious and knew she would never let the princess have his love. The princess looked at the young lady in surprise, as her expression was still strange. Aristina wondered if she had reacted too weakly to her words. But in turn, the young lady was angry. The princess sighed heavily because she knew that social life was very difficult. Dione turned around as she heard someone knocking at the door. She was furious and wondered if the maids had returned so early. She was angry as she knew she had not yet shown the princess to her place, but the princess was calm and a moment later gave her permission for the man to enter. The young lady was shocked because she saw her friend instead of the maids. She was puzzled and did not understand what he was doing there. The young man bowed slowly and humbly greeted the princess. He said that the ceremony would soon begin. He also asked the princess if she had any problems with the preparations. Diona was shocked, as the video showed that her friend followed the formal etiquette of the war set for the royal family. She was very surprised, as he addressed the princess as if she was already part of the royal family he served. The princess looked at the young knight in surprise and informed him that such an address sounded very strange for now. She told him that she had no particular problems, and therefore he could stand up. The young knight silently did everything the princess told him to do. The princess looked at the knight with a smile and said that they hadn't talked for a long time. He sighed heavily and said that it was just like that because they rarely met, so he couldn't introduce himself properly. But a moment later he looked closely at the young lady and asked what she was doing. Here Diona was taken aback, as she did not expect such a question from him. She was puzzled and did not know how much he knew about this situation. She was very worried because she understood that he was not as easy to deal with as the foolish general. She looked at the young man puzzled and worried, because she understood that one wrong word and she would not live. The princess looked closely at the young people and said with a smile that the lady had come and said that she would like to congratulate her on her wedding. Durant looked at the princess with a smile and asked if the lady really wanted to congratulate her. The young lady was taken aback and said with a smile that everything was exactly like that. She said that she wished them a happy marriage. The princess looked at them in surprise and said that besides congratulating the lady, she had told her a lot of other things. Diona looked nervously at the princess and asked if she had really talked that much. She smiled and said that she hadn't said anything except congratulations. Durant, looking at the princess, said that he was also very interested to hear what the lady had talked about. The princess was surprised, looked at him and asked if he wouldn't get bored. He looked at the princess with a grin and said that it would be very exciting. The princess in turn looked at him with bewilderment. She sighed heavily because she understood that this was a bold statement that could only be made by someone who did not know what the conversation was about. The princess understood perfectly well that usually the listeners did not ask about the lovers of whom the narrator was proud because it was not interesting to them. Such stories are interesting only to the narrator himself. And besides, if during the story, someone's indifference will rise, and this will be the narrator's, then he will get very angry. She held her breath as she knew it was a very tedious topic, but unfortunately, the princess could not do anything because the knight was interested. She glanced sideways at the young lady with a smirk on her face, knowing that several listeners were better than one. She looked at the young lady with a smile, knowing that she was doing everything for her, and she could continue to share her pride with others. The young lady in turn was taken aback and hesitated. She said that she would turn out to be a princess. I misunderstood her and she didn't say anything special. She only spoke about a peaceful wedding and her congratulations. Durant looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The princess sighed heavily and told the young lady that she had become more timid when another interlocutor appeared. Aristina looked at everyone present and quoted the young lady as saying that she was simply proud of the relationship she had with the prince since childhood. A moment later, the princess said that the young lady also mentioned that the prince's mother valued her very much. Aristina sighed heavily as saying the word lady herself was awkward. The princess looked at everyone present with a joyful smile and said that the prince and lady were in an extremely strong relationship. Durant looked at all the ladies present with fury and asked the princess if the lady had really said that and then congratulated her on her wedding. The princess looked at the knight and said that it was exactly like that, and she also said that their marriage was nothing more than an alliance for the sake of peace, so it was bound to be successful. The young lady was taken aback and told her friend that the princess had misunderstood everything. He looked at her with fury and asked if she had really said that she and the prince were in a strong relationship. The princess looked at the young people in surprise, as she did not understand what was happening. The princess looked at the young lady intently, as she did not understand why she had told the purpose of her visit and was now trembling so frightened. She knew that usually her bride's noisy talk about her groom could be an excellent reason for a slap, but the princess and the prince had a special case. They decided that they would live as business partners connected by a political marriage. The princess in turn thought that the prince considered the lady special, and the lady in turn knew about this very well and was proud of such an attitude, but now she understood that something was wrong. The princess looked at the knight intently and informed him that she was fine and that he should not worry. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that. The young princess knew that she had to take the young lady's side because if she did so, she would be able to play the card in front of the prince in the future. She looked at the knight intently as she knew that he didn't need to worry about something like that since nothing special had happened this time, but she froze in shock when she saw his face. She was in shock. She didn't understand why he was so angry with her. The young man sighed heavily and told the princess that a wedding only happens once in a lifetime. After a short pause, he asked the princess if she was sure she was okay. She looked at him in surprise, not knowing what to answer. The young lady shouted at the knight that he had misunderstood everything. He looked at her menacingly and said that she should keep quiet. Aristina was surprised and did not understand what he was so angry about. She was well aware that a political marriage had been concluded between her and the prince. She sighed heavily because she knew that even knowing all the ins and outs, there would still be people who would speak out against it. She sighed heavily and looking at the young knight called him. She said that at their first meeting she asked him to tell only the truth. She smiled a soft smile and said that for that reason she wouldn't lie to him either. She said that he should believe her because she really was fine. Durant looked at her in surprise but didn't answer. A moment later, he sighed heavily and clenched his fists in rage, agreeing with the princess. He said that if that was her will, and since there were no problems in the preparations, then he would go. The princess smiled back at him and agreed with him. As he left, he looked at the young lady with fury. Diona shuddered from his gaze. But a moment later, the knight stopped at the door and looked at the princess with a gentle smile. After a short pause, he congratulated her with a smile on her wedding. She smiled and thanked him for congratulating her second. Durant looked at the princess with a playful smile and said that this was not so because he congratulated her first. Sometime later, the princess and the young lady were left alone in the room. The lady was puzzled as she knew that she was in trouble because she had never seen the young knight so angry before. The princess looked at the young lady in surprise and asked where she was going. The princess with her grin asked the lady if she was thinking of saying goodbye. Aristina wanted to know if the young lady had already finished praising her boyfriend Diona, was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. She was trembling with fear because she did not know where to hide from the princess. She understood that the princess was pretending to be naive, but in fact she was a master of torture. A moment later, the young lady cried out that she urgently needed to go to the toilet. The princess looked after the young lady in surprise. Aristina in turn sighed heavily. She wondered if the young lady was so desperate that she left the room with their lightning speed, but the princess in turn was a little puzzled. She did not understand why the girl had such a face. At the same time, the young lady left the room with lightning speed and ran after the knight. Despite the lack of etiquette, she flew at full speed towards the young knight. She screamed and called him as if she wanted to explain herself. Everyone looked at her intently, as they had never seen her behave like this before. The young lady caught up with the knight with lightning speed and asked him to listen to her. He looked at her intently and said that she could tell him here and now. She was excited, said that everyone was watching them now, and suggested that they move to another place in order to discuss everything. He sighed heavily but agreed. Diona looked at the young man with concern and informed him that he had unfortunately misunderstood her. She said that she had only wanted to offer the princess her help for the sake of her well-being in marriage with the prince. She said that it was better to let the princess know in advance that the principal was to her liking. For this reason, she told the princess about their childhood to explain how she knew his preference. She said that she did not expect the princess to take it the wrong way. He looked at the young lady closely and called her Durant. Looking at the lady asked what this had to do with him. The young lady froze in shock and surprise. He looked at the young lady with contempt and malice and told her that there was more truth in actions than in words. For this reason, he no longer needed her explanations because he knew very well how she looked at the prince. The young lady was frightened. She wondered if he had guessed everything. She understood that if he knew about everything, he would definitely take her side. She looked at the young man in confusion and asked why he was doing this. Then she knew that he simply had to take care of her and support her. She looked closely at the young man as she knew perfectly well that he was alive thanks to her brother. The young man didn't have time to say anything because a general entered the hall with lightning speed and called his friend. Diona beamed with happiness when she saw the General. Mukali looked at his friend in surprise and asked where he had gone. A moment later, he looked at the young lady in surprise as he did not understand why she was crying. With lightning speed, the young lady fell into the general's arms. He excitedly reassured her and said that he was with her. The general looked at his friend in surprise and excitedly asked why he had communicated with the lady in such a way. Durant sighed heavily and said that he had only expressed his opinion. Mukali looked at his friend in anger and said that he did not know the reason, but it was clear that Durant was absolutely to blame for everything. The general was furious. He did not understand why his friend was offending their little beautiful baby. He shouted that the young lady was a very obedient child. Durant sighed heavily and told his friend that he sometimes envied his simplicity. Durant looked coldly at the young lady and said that she should remember his words. He said that he did not care how she behaved with the princess. The young lady shuddered at his words. She could not move. He looked at the lady with cold fury and said that she must be well aware of the consequences of that if she threw His Majesty the prince off his stride. The young lady was scared. She understood that the young man could kill everyone who stood in the prince's way. The young lady, trembling with fear, said that the young man was too rude. With tears in her eyes, she told the general that she considered him as a brother, but it seemed that he did not consider her a sister in return. The general was shocked and told the young lady that it was not about her at all. He just had a difficult character, but inside he valued her. Diona burst into tears. The lady said that this had never happened before, and she did not understand what had changed. She was puzzled and had no idea at all that the princess had told him about her. He looked at her in surprise, but after a few seconds she was taken aback and told the general that he should forget her words. The general thought for a moment and wondered if the princess was involved in this matter. He remembered that his friend had also mentioned the princess. He knew that if it was the princess, he would rather listen to her story. The maid looked at the princess's companion and said that she should be a little more careful. She was giving her instructions. Rosalind looked at the maid with fury and shouted that she was just a servant, and also asked if this one really thought that she did not understand this. The young princess sighed heavily as she realized that the ceremony had finally begun. A moment later, she pushed her maid aside and stepped forward. The reporters watched the young princess closely. They knew that they had to take pictures as quickly as possible and take as many beautiful and bright pictures as possible. The young ladies whispered to each other, swallowing nervously until they had fused the princess's veil. A moment later, the young princess saw her groom. She froze for a moment when she saw him in his formal attire. She froze for a moment and wondered if it was all the flashes of the cameras because for just a moment she thought she saw a look of confusion in his ever-cold eyes. Some time later, they were both at the altar. The priest was telling them that this marriage was not just a union between a man and a woman. It marked the end of a long struggle between their countries. Through their marriage, peace and harmony would be established in the two countries. The priest looked at the young people with a smile and blessed them. The young ladies looked at the pair of them and discussed as they knew that no matter how beautiful the princess was, because of her origin, she was small and homely. They were ashamed to compare the princess with Lady Diona. The priest looked closely at the newlyweds and said with a smile that they should now exchange vow kisses. The newlyweds were dumbfounded as they did not expect anything like this at all. The young princess glanced sideways at her husband. She wondered if he was worried. She sighed heavily as she knew that the vow kiss was a standard part of the marriage vows. The prince in turn froze in place. He did not know what to do or how to behave. Aristina thought for a moment as she had been told earlier that the prince would be very emotional on his wedding day. She knew that he had been very shy before. She understood that the more time passed, the more shy he became. She knew that she had to calm him down. The princess touched his hand tenderly and quietly called the prince. She smiled and told him that everything was fine and it was just a condition when certain parts of the body touch. The prince froze in bewilderment. She smiled and told him that there was no need to be so embarrassed because there was nothing special about it. She looked at the prince intently and with all her looks told him that he should be nicer. He sighed heavily and said that if she said there was nothing special about it, then she must have had a lot of experience in kissing. A moment later, he backed away, not understanding why he had asked her such a question. She smiled and said that it was not so, and also asked why he thought so. She said that for her, a kiss was nothing special because it was just a touch of body parts. She took his hand tenderly and said that it was just a normal touch. He became embarrassed as she touched his hand in different places. The princess looked at her husband with a tender smile and said that a kiss was no different. The prince looked at her intently and asked if she was really saying now that a kiss was no different. A moment later, he grabbed her with all his passion and pulled her towards him for a passionate kiss. Everyone present was embarrassed by such behavior of the young people. The prince kissed his princess tenderly in full view of everyone. The reporters whispered among themselves and admired the prince and princess. The princess looked at her husband closely and said that he was very impulsive and she did not expect this at all. He asked in surprise if that was all. The reporters looked at them with surprise and admiration because they saw that the young people loved each other. The young princess saw that the people's reaction was very passionate, but on the other hand, there was the queen and the count, who looked at her with such hatred as if they would tear her to pieces. The queen looked at the young lady with surprise and a grin. The princess in turn looked at the queen with bewilderment, as it seemed to her that she was plotting something. After the vow of a kiss, they left the wedding venue, but the wedding celebration did not end there. A wedding parade was to take place next. The event through which the people will learn about the wedding. Having gone all the way, the celebration will be completed. The princess knew that the king also went to the prince's palace along the main road. She looked into the crowd in surprise as she saw a lot of people. They were all happy for the prince and princess, and they chanted their names tirelessly. They shouted that they heard that she had come to them in an old-fashioned carriage to see how people were suffering. Because of the war, they knew that she was very weak, but still had come such a long way. They shouted that the girl was made for the people. They also said that she was very beautiful. The young lady was in shock, and for some reason, her heart was bursting before this. She had never met with the people officially. She saw that they were shining with happiness. The young princess was surprised as she had never seen so many smiling people before. Without realizing it, she also broke into a smile. Everyone was surprised, but at the same time glad that she smiled at them. Aristina looked at her husband and called him. She looked at him in surprise and said that he should not sit still. She looked at him in surprise as she saw that he was puzzled. Aristina was worried because he had been strange from the beginning. She noticed that he had completely withdrawn into himself and looked even more ferocious than usual. Aristina looked closely at her husband and called him. He nervously asked what she wanted. She sighed heavily and looking at her husband said that he should smile. The prince looked at her in bewilderment. She said that now in front of him were people who valued and loved him, and it would be better if he smiled at them since now he looked too stern. He sighed heavily and said that he always looked like that. Aristina told the prince that she was his business partner and that their destinies and politics were linked. Aristina said that at the celebration, the queen's eyes were bleeding so much that she wanted to find fault with them. She looked at her husband closely and asked him if it wouldn't be better for them to show that they had a good relationship. He sighed heavily and asked if he really had to do it just because of that. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand what he was talking about. A moment later, she asked in bewilderment if there really had to be another reason Tarkin realized that the wedding did not evoke any emotions in her. He noticed that she felt fine and he, on the contrary, he sighed heavily and agreed with her. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The prince said he would smile. The princess looked at him with a smile and asked if it was true. A moment later, the prince looked tenderly at his wife and smiled back at her. She froze in surprise when she saw his beautiful smile. He asked with a playful smile what the sleepyhead was doing, and also said that she should smile too. Taken aback, she came to her senses as she remembered that she also had to do this. A moment later, they greeted everyone with a smile. Aristina was a little puzzled as she herself did not notice how intently she was looking at her husband. Everyone present shouted and wished them happiness. The circle along the royal road held within itself the hope of a couple living together until death do them part. For this reason, the princess was going to get a divorce after the prince ascended the throne. She knew that this parade was meaningless, but nevertheless, as the people the kingdom wanted, it was a peace treaty. She understood perfectly well that she had to protect the prince. A moment later, the coachman was taken aback. He was puzzled because he did not understand why they were carried in one direction, but a few seconds later, the carriage wheel cracked. The young lady unconsciously began to fall to the side. She was scared and confused because she did not understand what was happening. The princess was puzzled. She realized that due to the recoil from the broken carriage mount, the horses became excited and accelerated their pace, and for this reason the carriage could now crash into the ground. She sighed heavily and closed her eyes because she knew that nothing terrible would happen, because she was already accustomed to pain. Everyone present looked at the newlyweds with fear because they understood that something bad could happen. But a moment later, the princess opened her eyes as nothing had happened, and she was not in pain. Unexpectedly for herself, she felt hot and elastic skin at one time, but she felt a familiar and unfamiliar feeling. She sighed heavily as she realized that everything was true, and this had happened before. She looked in surprise at her husband, who was holding her in a tight grip. With lightning speed, the prince cut the connection between the carriage and the horses. Everyone froze in surprise. The prince jumped out of the carriage with ease and grace in midair with his wife in his arms. The carriage crashed to the ground with a roar, and everyone present looked at the young men with their mouths open. The young princess was surprised because she knew that he was strong, but she did not expect that he could stop the rushing carriage with just his feet. He looked closely at his wife and asked excitedly if she was all right. The young lady, trembling, said that she was all right. She looked closely at her husband because she knew that thanks to him she was not hurt, and everything went without losses, but she knew that now things were bad because the horses had run away and the carriage was broken. This meant that the wedding parade was disrupted. Her role as a business partner was to ensure a successful marriage and to increase the prince's political status,